She was born into one of the most powerful families on earth, palaces, crowns, and an empire that stretched across 11 time zones. Yet she would end her life milking cows on a foreign farm, after watching her entire family murdered by revolutionaries, while her brother, the Tsar of Russia, was executed in the dead of night. She survived. No rescue mission, no miracle escape, just a series of narrow, brutal choices that kept her alive when almost no one else was. How did Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna, the sister of the last Tsar of Russia, escape a fate that killed nearly every Romanov? And how did a woman born to absolute power become the last living child of any Russian emperor, dying quietly in exile? Thousands of miles from home? This is not a fairy tale. This is a survival story, and it begins at the moment the Russian Empire started to bleed. On June 13, 1882, in the quiet opulence of Peterhof Palace, a child was born into a world that believed itself eternal. Her name was Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna. Outside the palace walls, the Gulf of Finland lay calm, reflecting the pale northern sky. Inside, gold-trimmed corridors echoed with the rituals of empire, priests murmuring prayers, courtiers whispering formal congratulations, servants moving with rehearsed precision. Another Romanov had arrived. Another guarantee, it seemed, that the dynasty would endure at the time. The Russian Empire was one of the largest and most powerful states on earth. It stretched from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean, ruled by divine right, protected by armies, and feared by rivals. To be born a Romanov was to inherit certainty, safety, privilege, and permanence, but history had already begun to crack beneath the marble floors. Olga was the youngest child of Tsar Alexander III, a towering, iron-willed ruler who believed deeply in autocracy, and Empress Maria Feodorovna, born Princess Dagmar of Denmark, whose family ties bound Russia to nearly every royal house in Europe. Through her mother alone, Olga was related to the British royal family, the Greek monarchy, and the Danish throne. She was, quite literally, royalty of royal blood. Yet from the moment she entered the world, danger lingered close. Only 1 year before Alexander III had taken the throne, his father, Tsar Alexander II, had been assassinated in the streets of St. Petersburg by revolutionaries. Bombs, conspiracies, and underground movements were no longer distant rumors. They were lived realities. The Romanovs ruled an empire in which loyalty was enforced, not earned, and resentment simmered beneath the surface. Alexander III never forgot how his reign began, with blood on the snow. As a result, Olga's childhood would be shaped less by luxury than by fear and control. The family abandoned the openness of the Winter Palace in favor of Gatchina Palace, a fortified residence outside the capital. It was beautiful, but isolated, secure, but heavy with tension. Despite her imperial title, Olga's early life was surprisingly austere. The Romanov children slept on hard beds. They woke at dawn. They washed in cold water. Breakfast was plain porridge, not silver platters of excess. Their education was strict and conservative. History, geography, religion, classical literature, and languages. Discipline mattered more than comfort. Strength mattered more than indulgence. Alexander III wanted his children prepared for a hostile world. For Olga, her father was more than a czar. He was her emotional anchor, tall, imposing, and deeply traditional. He softened only with his youngest daughter. Years later, Olga would describe him simply as everything to her. His presence made the rigid structure of court life feel safe, almost human. Her relationship with her mother was different. Empress Maria Feodorovna loved her children, but affection was filtered through protocol. She was warm by royal standards, yet emotionally reserved. Olga learned early that tenderness was rare currency in imperial life. and that feelings were best kept private among her siblings. Olga was the baby of the family. Her eldest brother, Nicholas, was already being shaped into the future Tsar, burdened with expectations he neither sought nor fully understood. Another brother had died in infancy. Grand Duke George, frail and ill, would later die young as well. The siblings closest to Olga in age, Michael and Xenia, would become her lifelong emotional companions. Together, they grew up inside a golden cage. The empire around them was changing faster than anyone inside the palace wanted to admit. Industrialization crept forward. Political ideologies spread quietly among workers and intellectuals. Words like socialism, anarchism, and revolution began to circulate in whispered conversations. But to a child like Olga, these were distant storms. Her world was defined by corridors, uniforms, church bells, and family dinners conducted under watchful eyes. She learned early how to observe without speaking, how to listen without asking questions. Survival, even then, depended on silence. And yet, there were moments of innocence. Summer days at Peterhof, the sound of waves against the shore, laughter shared with Xenia and Michael, the brief illusion that the world beyond the palace walls did not exist. That illusion would not last, because Olga Alexandrovna was born at the end of an era. Even if no one yet dared to say it aloud, the empire that cradled her infancy was already rotting from within. The dynasty that celebrated her birth would soon be hunted, imprisoned, and erased. She was the last child of a collapsing world, and though she could not know it then, her life would become a living witness to one of history's most violent transformations, from absolute power to absolute loss. The Romanov story did not end with her birth. In many ways, it began there. If Olga Alexandrovna had been born into the Romanov dynasty, expecting a life of effortless splendor, that illusion would have been stripped away almost immediately. The Russian Imperial family lived with a truth few outsiders understood. Their power made them targets. After the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, paranoia was no longer optional. It was policy. Guards doubled, routes changed without warning, windows were reinforced, conversations were monitored. The Romanovs did not simply rule Russia, they hid from it, for Olga and her siblings. This meant growing up far from the glittering heart of St. Petersburg. The family retreated to Gatchina Palace, a massive but heavily guarded residence surrounded by forests and distance. It was less a palace than a fortress masquerading as one. Here, childhood was designed to harden, not soften. Luxury was considered dangerous. Comfort was viewed as weakness. Alexander III believed indulgence had corrupted previous generations, and he would not repeat that mistake. His children were raised under strict routines meant to instill obedience, humility, and endurance. They slept on narrow camp beds with thin mattresses. They woke at dawn, regardless of season. They washed in icy water. Even during Russian winters, complaints were not tolerated. Meals were simple and repetitive. Porridge in the morning, plain dishes in the evening. There were no elaborate feasts for children. No excess meant to remind them of privilege. Olga later recalled that her upbringing was closer to that of a military household than a royal court. Education followed the same philosophy. Tutors drilled the children relentlessly in Russian history, geography, Orthodox theology, and classical literature. They learned French, English, German, and Danish, languages of diplomacy and exile. Though no one yet spoke that word aloud, discipline was enforced through structure, not affection. Mistakes were corrected immediately. Emotions were quietly dismissed. for Olga. This environment shaped a personality that was observant, inward-looking, and unusually grounded for a Grand Duchess. She learned early how to endure discomfort without protest, how to adapt without drawing attention to herself. That skill would later save her life. Despite the severity of her upbringing, Olga was not unhappy as a child. She found warmth where she could, in moments with her siblings, in times spent outdoors, in the quiet approval of her father, Alexander III, for all his severity, doted on his youngest daughter. When he was present, the tension inside Gatchina eased, but danger was never far away. In October 1888, when Olga was just 6 years old, the Imperial family boarded a train returning from the Caucasus. It was meant to be a routine journey, a controlled environment. Safe. It wasn't. Without warning, the train derailed at high speed near the town of Borki. Cars twisted violently off the tracks. Metal crushed metal. Screams cut through the chaos. 21 people were killed. The Romanovs survived, but only barely. Accounts from survivors quickly turned into legend. It was said that Alexander III, enormous in stature, held up the collapsing roof of the dining car with his bare hands while others escaped. More likely, chaos ruled, and survival was a matter of seconds and chance. Empress Maria Feodorovna tore her own clothes to bandage the wounded. For young Olga, the message was unmistakable. Death could reach even the Tsar. Rumors spread almost immediately that the derailment had not been an accident, though investigations concluded otherwise. Suspicion lingered. The idea that unseen enemies were always watching, always waiting, became part of the family's shared consciousness. From that moment on, safety became obsession. Security tightened further. Travel was reduced. Isolation increased. The Romanov children grew up knowing that their name inspired devotion in some and murderous hatred in others. Outside Gatchina's walls, Russia continued to change. Factories expanded. Cities grew. Workers organized. Radical pamphlets circulated in secret. Ideas once whispered now had voices. The empire was modernizing unevenly, violently, and leaving millions behind. Inside the palace, time felt frozen. The Romanovs lived according to traditions that assumed permanence, divine right, absolute authority, loyalty enforced through fear and faith. But the world beyond their guarded gates no longer believed in those truths. Olga, still a child, sensed the contradiction without understanding it. She lived surrounded by guards, yet felt unprotected. She carried a title that commanded respect, yet could not grant safety. She belonged to the most powerful family in Russia, and yet grew up learning restraint, caution, and silence. The empire wanted its rulers strong. History would demand something else entirely. By the time Olga reached adolescence, the foundations of her world were already unstable. She simply did not know how close they were to collapse, and the first pillar was about to fall. In the autumn of 1894, the world Olga Alexandrovna knew collapsed quietly, without revolution, without gunfire, without warning. Her father was dying. Tsar Alexander III, the embodiment of strength and authority, had been ill for months. At first, the court spoke in whispers, insisting it was nothing serious. A cold, exhaustion, the natural toll of ruling an empire. But the truth could not be hidden for long. His kidneys were failing. The most powerful man in Russia was losing a battle no army could fight. Olga was 12 years old. She had always seen her father as immovable, physically massive, emotionally steady, unshakable. To witness him weakened, confined to bed, surrounded by doctors who could offer nothing but false hope, shattered the last illusions of safety she possessed. The imperial family gathered at Livadia Palace in Crimea, where Alexander III hoped the warmer climate might slow his decline. Instead, it became the place where an era ended for Olga. Those final weeks were marked by silence and fear. Adults spoke in hushed tones. Curtains were drawn. Time seemed to stretch endlessly between prayers. She stayed close to her father, watching his breathing, memorizing his face, sensing, without fully understanding, that something irreversible was happening. When Alexander III died on November 1, 1894, the Russian Empire lost its ruler. Olga lost her anchor. Years later, she would say that her father's death felt like the ground disappearing beneath her feet. With him gone, the rigid but familiar structure of her childhood dissolved. Nothing replaced it. Almost immediately, the weight of the empire shifted onto her eldest brother. Nicholas II, only 26 years old, ascended the throne. He was gentle, introspective, and deeply unprepared for the responsibility thrust upon him. Even he admitted it openly. On the day of his coronation, Nicholas reportedly confided that he did not know how to rule. Russia would pay dearly for that uncertainty. Within the family, roles changed overnight. Nicholas became distant, consumed by duty and expectation. Court life intensified. Protocol thickened. The Romanovs were no longer secluded observers of power. They were its public face once again. For Olga, this transition was deeply unsettling. She was still a child, yet suddenly expected to participate in a world of ceremonies, appearances, and rigid social hierarchies. Gachina's isolation gave way to the suffocating formality of imperial society. Dinners grew longer. Conversations grew colder. Every movement was watched, judged, and remembered. She did not belong there. Not yet. Olga struggled to adapt. She was shy, blunt, uncomfortable with false pleasantries, where others mastered the art of polite detachment. She remained emotionally transparent, often saying too much or too little. In a court built on appearances, sincerity was a liability. Her grief made things worse. While Nicholas leaned into duty and her mother leaned into protocol, Olga carried her loss inward. She withdrew, becoming more introspective, more observant. The girl who once laughed freely at Gachina now moved cautiously through gilded halls, aware that nothing, not even family, was permanent. The empire, meanwhile, demanded optimism. Nicholas married Princess Alex of Hesse, who became Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna, only weeks after their father's funeral. To the public, it was a symbol of continuity. To Olga, it felt abrupt, almost cruel, a reminder that the machinery of power did not pause for grief. She watched as her brother struggled beneath expectations he could not meet, as tensions between the new empress and the Russian court grew, as the distance between ruler and people quietly widened. And she felt it. Something was wrong. Russia was changing faster than the Romanovs could understand. Workers protested. Students radicalized. The memory of her grandfather's assassination still haunted the dynasty. The system her father had defended with iron resolve was now in the hands of a man who ruled by conscience rather than force. Olga did not analyze politics. She felt them. She sensed instability in the stiffness of court rituals. She sensed danger in the smiles of courtiers. She sensed fragility behind the icons and crowns. The empire no longer felt eternal. It felt strained. Her childhood had ended not with rebellion or exile, but with a funeral. From that moment on, Olga Alexandrovna was no longer simply the youngest Romanov. She was a witness, quiet, observant, and increasingly aware that the world she was born into might not survive her. And she was right. because the death of Alexander III was not just the loss of a father. It was the beginning of the end. After the death of Alexander III, the Romanov family returned to a world that no longer felt secure and no longer pretended to be. If Gatchina Palace had been a fortress of controlled isolation, the Imperial Court of St. Petersburg was a stage built on anxiety. Every appearance was measured, every word was weighed, every smile hid calculation. Under Nicholas II, the empire tried to project continuity. But beneath the surface, uncertainty ruled. For Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna, now entering her teenage years, the shift was jarring. She had been raised to endure hardship quietly, not to perform. Court life demanded the opposite. Dinners stretched for hours. Conversations followed invisible rules. Courtiers bowed, flattered, and competed for favor with rehearsed precision. Nothing was spontaneous. Nothing was sincere. Olga found it exhausting. She was expected to attend formal events, to stand beside her mother and sisters-in-law, to dress, smile, and speak when spoken to. Yet she lacked the polish expected of a Grand Duchess. She was blunt, emotionally transparent, uncomfortable with hypocrisy, in a court where survival depended on subtlety. Olga stood out, and not in a good way. Security around the imperial family intensified year after year. Guards were everywhere. Routes were changed at the last minute. Windows were reinforced, even inside palaces. Doors were locked and monitored. The Romanovs lived surrounded by luxury, yet functionally imprisoned by their own power. Threats were no longer abstract. Revolutionary groups operated openly in the cities. Assassinations of officials were reported regularly. Political pamphlets circulated among workers and students. The empire was still vast, but loyalty was thinning, especially among those who felt crushed beneath its weight. Nicholas II, unlike his father, responded not with brute force, but with denial. He believed deeply in his divine right to rule. He believed the people loved him. He believed unrest was exaggerated by radicals and foreign influences. This disconnect widened the gap between the throne and the streets with every passing year. Olga observed all of it from the margins. She watched her brother retreat inward, leaning on ritual and faith instead of reform. She watched her sister-in-law, Empress Alexandra Feodorovna, struggle to win acceptance from a court that distrusted her German origins and her intense religiosity. She watched alliances form and dissolve over whispers, and she learned something crucial. Power did not guarantee control. Though young, Olga sensed that the empire was being held together by habit rather than conviction. The rituals continued because they always had, not because they still worked. Beneath the polished surfaces, something brittle was forming. Yet life went on. Education continued. Languages were refined. Social obligations multiplied. Olga was instructed in art, music, and etiquette. Though she showed little interest in becoming a decorative figure, she preferred honest work, animals, and time outdoors, things that felt real in a world increasingly defined by pretense. Her closest emotional bonds remained within her family. She was especially close to Grand Duchess Xenia, whose warmth provided comfort in an otherwise cold environment, with her brother Michael. She shared a sense of displacement, a feeling of not quite fitting into the roles assigned to them. Unlike Nicholas, neither Olga nor Michael had been raised to rule. That, paradoxically, made them more perceptive. As Olga moved toward adulthood, conversations about her future began quietly, but inevitably, in Imperial Russia. Marriage was not a personal decision, it was a political instrument. Alliances were forged not by affection, but by bloodlines and convenience. Potential suitors were discussed in drawing rooms and offices long before they were ever mentioned to her. Names were floated, backgrounds examined, fortunes assessed. Feelings were irrelevant. Olga understood this and dreaded it. She had grown up seeing what duty did to people. She saw it in Nicholas's exhaustion. in her mother's emotional restraint, in the rigid unhappiness that haunted the court. She did not want a life built entirely on obligation. But choice was a luxury Romanov daughters rarely possessed. Outside the palace gates, Russia edged closer to upheaval. Inside, the dynasty continued as though stability were a matter of will alone. The contrast was growing sharper, more dangerous. Olga stood between two worlds, one built on tradition, the other on inevitable change. She did not yet know how violently those worlds would collide, but she could feel it coming, and for the Romanovs. Feeling was already too late. Years before Olga Alexandrovna understood politics, ideology, or revolution, she learned a simpler, harsher truth. Power does not protect you from death. The lesson came violently, without warning. On an autumn afternoon in October 1888, Olga was 6 years old when the Imperial train departed the Crimean Peninsula, carrying Tsar Alexander III, Empress Maria Feodorovna, their children, and a small court entourage back towards central Russia. The journey was routine, carefully planned, secured to the highest standard available to the Russian Empire. No one expected disaster. Inside the dining car, the Romanov family was having lunch. The atmosphere was relaxed by imperial standards. The children sat near their parents. Conversation drifted easily. Outside, the countryside passed by in a blur of trees and fields. Then, without any clear warning, the world exploded. The train derailed at high speed near the town of Borky. Cars lurched violently off the tracks. Metal screamed against metal. The dining car was crushed beneath the collapsing roof. Tables flipped, bodies were thrown. Screams filled the air. 21 people died. The imperial family survived, but survival felt more like chance than fate. In the chaos that followed, stories spread rapidly. Witnesses claimed Tsar Alexander III used his massive strength to hold up the crushed roof, allowing his family and servants to escape. The image of the Tsar physically holding back death became legend, symbolic, heroic, almost mythological. The truth was likely less cinematic and more brutal. Empress Maria Feodorovna tore strips from her own clothing to bandage the wounded. Guards pulled survivors from twisted wreckage. Blood stained the floors. Panic replaced protocol. Order dissolved into instinct. For young Olga, the experience was terrifying and incomprehensible. She remembered the noise. She remembered the fear on adult faces. She remembered the sudden realization that nothing was guaranteed, not even the safety of the Tsar. In the aftermath, official investigations concluded the crash was an accident, caused by excessive speed and structural failure. But almost immediately, rumors began to circulate. Some whispered sabotage. Others spoke of revolutionary plots. The idea that enemies had tried, and failed, to kill the imperial family took hold in the public imagination. Whether true or not, the damage was done from that moment forward. Security paranoia intensified dramatically. Travel was reduced further. Routes were altered constantly. Guards multiplied. Isolation deepened. The Romanovs became even more detached from the people they ruled. For Olga, the crash left an invisible mark. It introduced a constant undercurrent of awareness, an understanding that danger did not announce itself politely, that death could arrive in the middle of an ordinary meal, that the empire's enemies did not always wear uniforms or carry banners. Childhood innocence does not survive such realizations. After Borky, Olga became quieter, more observant. She watched adults more closely. She listened when they thought children were not paying attention. She learned to read tension in posture, danger in silence. The Romanovs continued their routines, but something fundamental had shifted. The crash became a symbol, one that Olga would carry with her for the rest of her life. It represented the fragility of the world she lived in, a reminder that the dynasty rested not on divine certainty, but on unstable ground. Outside the palace, Russia moved on. Factories expanded. Railways multiplied. Workers migrated to cities in massive numbers. The same industrial forces that built the empire's infrastructure also amplified its inequalities. Wealth concentrated at the top. Misery spread at the bottom. And the railways, symbols of progress, became conduits of unrest. Strikes broke out. Political literature spread along train routes. Revolutionary ideas traveled faster than soldiers could suppress them. The very systems meant to strengthen the empire were now carrying the seeds of its destruction inside the Romanov family. The response was denial mixed with fear. Alexander III doubled down on autocracy. Nicholas, watching from the sidelines, absorbed lessons of caution rather than reform. The empire's leadership retreated inward, convinced that strength meant rigidity. Olga, still a child, absorbed a different lesson. She learned that survival depended on awareness, not authority, on adaptability, not entitlement, on understanding when to be visible and when to disappear. Years later, when revolution came and Romanovs were hunted, imprisoned, and executed, Olga would survive where others did not. That survival did not begin in exile. It began on a broken train track in 1888, when a little girl learned that the empire she was born into could collapse in a single, terrifying moment. After the train crash at Borki, life inside the Romanov household resumed its rigid rhythms, but something essential had been lost. No one spoke openly about fear. The Imperial family never did. Vulnerability was treated as weakness, and weakness as danger. Instead, silence settled over the palace like a second layer of security. Conversations became shorter, laughter rarer. Even moments of affection felt restrained, as though joy itself might tempt fate for Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna. The change was subtle but irreversible. She was still a child, still surrounded by tutors, servants, and guards, but she was no longer innocent. The crash had planted a quiet understanding in her mind. The world could fracture without warning, and once fractured, it could never be fully repaired. Her father, Tsar Alexander III, became even more protective after Borki. His already rigid worldview hardened further. He trusted fewer people, allowed fewer freedoms. Travel became rare. Isolation deepened. The empire was ruled increasingly from behind walls, physical and psychological. Olga sensed this withdrawal. She watched as her father's strength, once reassuring, began to look like strain. He carried the weight of the empire alone, convinced that any concession would invite chaos. To his youngest daughter, he remained gentle, but even gentleness now felt guarded. Her mother, Empress Maria Feodorovna, retreated into order and routine. She managed anxiety through structure, believing discipline could hold the world together if applied firmly enough. Emotional distance was not cruelty, it was survival. Olga absorbed both approaches, yet belonged fully to neither. She grew more observant, more inward-looking. She noticed details others ignored, the tone of a voice, the pause before an answer, the tension in a room. She became skilled at sensing when to speak and when silence was safer. This instinct would later prove invaluable. Her education continued relentlessly. Languages multiplied. History lessons emphasized loyalty and tradition. The Orthodox faith was drilled deeply into daily life, reinforcing the belief that the Romanovs ruled by divine will. But even divine narratives could not erase what Olga had seen. She had watched the strongest man she knew nearly lose everything to chance. She had felt the violent lurch of the world slipping sideways. No prayer could undo that memory. Outside palace walls, the country drifted further from the image presented in textbooks. peasant unrest simmered quietly. Industrial workers crowded into cities, living in harsh conditions unimaginable to the imperial family. Political movements grew bolder, fueled by inequality and repression. The seeds planted by decades of autocratic rule were beginning to sprout inside the court. Few wanted to acknowledge it, to Olga. This denial felt increasingly dangerous. She was not a political thinker. She did not debate ideology or policy. But she possessed something rarer: emotional intelligence shaped by fear and loss. She understood instability on a personal level before she ever recognized it on a national one. Her siblings coped differently. Nicholas buried himself in duty, clinging to tradition as though ritual itself could guarantee stability. Xenia sought warmth in family bonds and later marriage. Michael, like Olga, often appeared uneasy with expectations placed upon him, aware that obedience did not equal safety. Together, they lived within a structure that demanded confidence but offered none. As Olga approached adolescence, whispers about her future grew louder. Marriage would come, sooner or later. It always did for Romanov daughters. The question was never if, but to whom, and for what purpose. She dreaded it. The idea of being exchanged like a political token unsettled her deeply. She wanted affection, authenticity, a life that felt real, not staged for appearances. But such desires rarely survived contact with imperial reality. She did not yet know that her first marriage would become another kind of prison. For now, she remained a witness, a girl standing at the edge of a world pretending to be stable. A child who had learned, far too early, that permanence was an illusion. The Romanov dynasty still ruled Russia. The palaces still stood. The ceremonies continued, to the outside world. Nothing seemed wrong, but inside, cracks were spreading. And Olga Alexandrovna, quiet, perceptive, and already shaped by loss, was growing up inside those cracks, learning how to survive a future no one else was willing to imagine. The empire believed it was eternal. Olga already knew better. By the late 1890s, Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna was no longer a child, but she was not yet allowed to be her own person. At 16, she stood at an awkward intersection of identity. Too old for the protected innocence of childhood. Too young to possess any real agency over her life. Around her, the imperial court moved with mechanical certainty, assigning roles, shaping futures, deciding destinies with quiet efficiency. Olga's destiny, like that of all Romanov daughters, was already being negotiated. The Russian court was not a place of warmth. It was a system, rigid, hierarchical, and relentlessly judgmental. Every gesture carried meaning. Every silence was interpreted. To exist within it required emotional armor, and Olga lacked the instinct or desire to wear one. She did not enjoy being watched at formal events. She stood stiffly beside her mother or sisters-in-law, painfully aware of eyes assessing her posture, her expression, her worth. Suitors were discussed openly in rooms she was not meant to overhear. Names floated through corridors like merchandise tags. Age, lineage, fortune, temperament. No one asked what she wanted. Olga felt increasingly out of place in the world she had been born into. Unlike many royal women of her time, she was not drawn to status or admiration. She disliked empty flattery and distrusted polished charm. Her nature leaned toward honesty, simplicity, and emotional directness, traits that made court life exhausting. She longed for normalcy in ways that bordered on rebellion. She enjoyed animals more than people, preferred outdoor work to salons, found comfort in routine tasks that produced tangible results. These inclinations were quietly discouraged. A Grand Duchess was meant to inspire awe, not shovel dirt or speak plainly. Yet Olga resisted transformation into an ornament. Her mother, Empress Maria Feodorovna, worried deeply about her youngest daughter, not because Olga misbehaved, but because she did not adapt, in a court where conformity ensured survival. Olga's refusal to mold herself to expectation felt dangerous. Behind closed doors, concern turned into urgency. Marriage would solve the problem. Marriage always did. A suitable match would stabilize Olga's position, remove her from daily court scrutiny, and bind her safely within a respectable, controllable arrangement. Love was irrelevant, compatibility secondary. What mattered was order. And so, the search intensified. Potential candidates were evaluated meticulously. Royal bloodlines were weighed against political value. Age gaps were dismissed as trivial. Personality flaws ignored if lineage was strong enough. Olga watched all of this unfold with growing dread. She was not naive. She understood that her life belonged, in many ways, to the dynasty. But understanding did not make acceptance easier. She wanted something profoundly unreasonable for a Romanov woman. A marriage that felt real. She confided little. Complaints were dangerous. Vulnerability could be weaponized. Instead, she internalized her anxiety, allowing it to shape her inwardly. She became quieter, more reserved, not out of obedience, but self-protection. Meanwhile, Russia continued its slow slide toward instability. Student demonstrations grew more frequent. Workers organized strikes. Intellectuals openly debated the failures of autocracy. Newspapers, tightly censored but increasingly bold, hinted at a society straining under its own contradictions. Inside the palace, these developments were treated as background noise. Nicholas II, now firmly on the throne, maintained his belief that unrest was temporary and exaggerated. He relied on advisors who reinforced his worldview, insulating himself from inconvenient truths. The distance between ruler and people widened steadily. Olga noticed. She listened when servants spoke quietly among themselves. She observed tension during public appearances. She sensed resentment in places where obedience once lived. These impressions unsettled her, not politically, but emotionally. It felt as though the ground beneath her life was shifting again. At the same time, pressure to finalize her future increased. The court was losing patience. Olga was no longer a child who could be indulged. She was a young woman who needed to be placed, efficiently and permanently. The solution arrived in the form of a man who seemed, on paper, entirely suitable. Duke Peter Alexandrovich of Oldenburg. He was well-connected, of acceptable lineage, financially troubled, though discreetly so, older than Olga by more than a decade. But that was considered an advantage. Maturity implied stability. To Olga, he felt like a stranger. She met him politely, spoke little, observed much. Something about the arrangement felt wrong from the beginning. Though she struggled to articulate why, it was not cruelty she sensed, but emptiness. A lack of genuine connection, a transaction disguised as destiny. Still, the momentum was unstoppable. By the turn of the century, Olga Alexandrovna stood on the threshold of a marriage she did not want, in a world she did not fit. Inside an empire already cracking beneath the surface, she did not yet know how deeply this decision would wound her. But she would soon learn that a gilded cage is still a cage, and that some prisons are built not of walls, but of expectations. The engagement of Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna to Duke Peter Alexandrovich of Oldenburg was announced as a triumph of dynastic order. At court, approval came quickly. Too quickly. Peter was 33 years old. Olga was 19. He belonged to a respected noble house, connected, though distantly, to the Romanovs through both her parents. He was intelligent, well-read, polite, and outwardly considerate, on paper. He was everything the court required. In reality, he was everything Olga feared. From the beginning, the arrangement felt less like a union than a solution. Whispers followed the announcement. Quiet. Careful, but persistent. Peter had never shown interest in women. He was known for gambling, for chronic debt, and for a private life that raised questions no one dared to ask directly. None of that mattered. What mattered was that the problem of Olga had been resolved. The wedding took place in 1901, wrapped in ritual and splendor. Icons gleamed beneath candlelight. Choirs filled the cathedral with sacred harmony. To the public, it was another display of imperial continuity, another Romanov secured within tradition. To Olga, it felt unreal. She stood beside Peter, reciting vows she did not understand emotionally, watched by hundreds of eyes measuring her performance. There was no sense of beginning, only finality. Childhood ended not with rebellion, but with compliance. After the ceremony, the newlyweds moved into a vast palace in St. Petersburg, over 200 rooms of marble, gold, and silence. They lived there together, but they did not live as husband and wife from the start. Their marriage was unconsummated. Peter occupied rooms at one end of the palace. Olga lived at the other. They dined together formally, spoke politely, and maintained appearances in private. They existed as strangers bound by a contract neither had written. Peter was not unkind. That, perhaps, made it worse. He treated Olga with courtesy, even gentleness, but without intimacy or desire. There was no passion, no partnership, no shared future. He seemed content with the arrangement, financial security, social legitimacy, and distance. Olga was not. She had entered marriage hoping, quietly, desperately, that something real might emerge, that affection might grow, that companionship might replace obligation. Instead, she found herself lonelier than she had ever been. The palace, enormous and beautiful, became suffocating. Days blurred together. She wandered empty halls, sat through formal dinners, attended events where she smiled on command and returned home to silence. The isolation ate away at her, without purpose, without affection, without a voice. She began to disappear inward. Depression took hold. Olga's health suffered. She lost weight. Her hair began to fall out in alarming amounts, forcing her to wear wigs to conceal the damage. Doctors offered vague diagnoses, rest cures, tonics. None addressed the cause. She was dying slowly, not physically, but emotionally. In 1903, barely 2 years into the marriage, Olga did something extraordinary for a woman of her position. She asked for a divorce. It was an unthinkable request. Divorce within the Romanov family was rare, scandalous, and dangerous. It threatened appearances, challenged authority, and exposed uncomfortable truths. When Olga approached Peter, hoping he might agree quietly, he refused. He had everything to lose. Without the marriage, his financial lifeline disappeared. His debts would resurface. His respectability would vanish. He had no intention of releasing her. Olga was trapped. The court closed ranks. Her brother, Tsar Nicholas II, avoided confrontation. Advisors urged patience, duty, endurance. This was the role she had been assigned. She was expected to endure it quietly, and for a time, she did. Yet not all was darkness during these years. Olga grew closer to her brother Nicholas and his young family. She adored his children, especially the youngest, Grand Duchess Anastasia, her goddaughter. With them, She found moments of genuine affection and laughter. In their presence, the weight of her own life eased slightly, but those moments were temporary. Each night, she returned to her silent palace. Each morning, she woke to the knowledge that her life was being spent in a performance with no audience that mattered. She had been raised to endure hardship. She had survived fear, loss, and isolation. But this slow erasure of self, was something else entirely. Olga began to understand a devastating truth. Titles do not protect you from unhappiness. Privilege does not guarantee freedom. And somewhere beneath the weight of duty and despair, something inside her began to resist. She did not yet know how, but she would not endure this forever. By the middle of the first decade of the 20th century, Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna had learned how to survive by becoming invisible. Outwardly, she fulfilled her role. She attended official functions. She stood beside her husband when required. She spoke politely, smiled when expected, and never revealed the extent of her unhappiness. To the court, she appeared fragile but compliant, another Romanov woman quietly bearing her fate. Inwardly, she was unraveling. The loneliness of her marriage deepened into a constant, dull ache. Days passed without meaning. Nights stretched endlessly. She felt trapped not only by her husband's refusal to release her, but by an entire system designed to prioritize appearance over truth. What tormented her most was not cruelty, but emptiness. There were no arguments, no dramatic confrontations, just silence, polite, endless, suffocating silence. The absence of love was harder to endure than overt hostility would have been. There was nothing to fight against, only something missing. Her health continued to decline. Doctors spoke in careful euphemisms: nervous exhaustion, female weakness, emotional sensitivity. Remedies focused on rest and restraint, never on freedom. The suggestion that her environment might be the source of her suffering was never voiced aloud. That possibility was too dangerous. In moments of rare honesty, Olga admitted to herself, if no one else, that she felt like a prisoner dressed as a duchess. Yet even prisons have cracks. Olga found solace in her relationship with her brother Tsar Nicholas II and, especially, with his children, in their presence. The rigid rules of court life softened. She became animated, affectionate, playful, almost herself again. She took them to events, protected them from protocol when she could, and forged bonds that felt genuine. Her devotion to Anastasia, her goddaughter, was particularly strong. The child's irreverence and energy delighted Olga. In Anastasia's laughter, she glimpsed the joy she herself had been denied. But joy, like everything else in her life, was temporary. Each visit ended, each shared moment dissolved back into duty. And every return to her own palace reminded her of the life she was wasting. It was during this period, quietly, cautiously, that Olga began to change. Not outwardly, inwardly. She started questioning the rules she had always accepted. The idea that duty justified suffering, that obedience was noble regardless of cost, that a woman's life could be negotiated without her consent. These were dangerous thoughts for a Romanov. The empire itself was showing signs of fracture. In 1905, Russia erupted in revolution for the first time. Strikes paralyzed cities, protesters marched, soldiers fired on crowds, blood stained the streets of St. Petersburg. The Romanovs survived the uprising, but the illusion of stability was shattered. Olga watched these events closely. She saw how quickly authority collapsed under pressure, how loyalty dissolved when fear outweighed obedience, how systems that claimed permanence could be forced to bend or break. The lesson was unmistakable. If an empire could be challenged, perhaps a marriage could be too. Around this time, Olga met Nikolai Kulikovsky, a cavalry officer from a respectable but unremarkable landed family. He was everything her husband was not: emotionally present, sincere, attentive. There was no grand strategy behind their connection, no ambition, no calculation, just recognition. For the first time in years, Olga felt seen, not as a title, not as a problem to be managed, but as a person. Their bond developed slowly, carefully, shaped by restraint and fear of consequence. She knew the danger of such attachment. She knew what discovery could mean, but she also knew she could not return to emptiness. The relationship did not immediately free her. In many ways, it complicated her life further. Yet it awakened something essential: the belief that happiness was not a fantasy, and that her suffering was not inevitable. Her first request for divorce had failed, but she would not stop trying. Olga Alexandrovna had spent her life enduring fear, loss, isolation, obligation. Now, quietly and without spectacle, she began her most dangerous act yet. She started choosing herself. She did not yet know how long it would take. She did not know the price she would pay. She did not know that history itself was accelerating toward catastrophe. But she knew one thing with absolute clarity: she would not disappear quietly. Not anymore. By the time Europe slid toward war in 1914, Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna was no longer merely unhappy. She was divided. For more than a decade, she had existed in a marriage that was real only on paper, bound to Duke Peter Alexandrovich of Oldenburg. Yet emotionally and physically alone. The court had grown accustomed to the arrangement. Appearances were maintained, scandal was avoided, silence was rewarded. But inside Olga, something had shifted beyond repair. Her relationship with Nikolai Kulikovsky had become the emotional center of her life. What began as cautious companionship evolved into quiet devotion. Nikolai did not flatter her title or fear her position. He spoke to her plainly, listened without calculation, offered presence rather than protocol. To Olga, this felt revolutionary. Yet the danger was immense. Nikolai was not royal. He was not even high nobility. He was a military officer of respectable background. But that was not enough. For a Romanov woman, especially the sister of the Tsar, marriage outside royal circles was almost unthinkable. Nicholas II made that clear. For years, Olga pleaded privately with her brother. She asked for recognition of the truth, that her marriage had never been a marriage at all, that she was wasting her life inside a lie, that Nikolai Kulikovsky was the only person who had ever offered her genuine happiness. Nicholas refused, not out of cruelty, but fear. Allowing the divorce, and especially approving a second marriage to a man of lower status, would set a precedent. It would weaken the already fragile authority of the throne. It would invite criticism, mockery, and challenge at a time when Russia could not afford instability. Duty, once again, outweighed personal truth. Olga endured, but history did not pause for family disputes. In the summer of 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand ignited World War I. Russia mobilized in defense of its Slavic allies. Millions of men were sent to the front. Supplies ran short. Defeats mounted. Morale collapsed. The war exposed everything the empire had tried to hide. The army was poorly equipped. Leadership was indecisive. The economy buckled under strain. Hunger spread. Anger followed. Faith in the monarchy eroded rapidly as losses mounted and promises failed. Inside the imperial family, pressure became unbearable. Nicholas II left the capital to take direct command of the army, a decision that would prove disastrous. Power in St. Petersburg fell increasingly to Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna, whose isolation, reliance on mysticism, and association with Rasputin alienated the court and the public alike. Olga watched all of this with growing alarm. She saw the empire unraveling at the seams. She felt the urgency in every conversation, every guarded glance. The Romanovs were no longer merely unpopular. They were vulnerable. And suddenly, the rules that had governed her life for so long felt meaningless. In 1916, with Russia bleeding and authority collapsing, Olga made a decision that would have been impossible only years earlier. She stopped waiting, using the legal argument that her marriage to Peter had never been consummated. She renewed her demand for divorce. This time, the circumstances were different. The empire was at war. The Tsar was distracted. The court was in disarray. And Nicholas II finally agreed. The divorce was granted quietly, without celebration or announcement. There was no triumph, only relief. 15 years of enforced emptiness ended not with joy, but with exhaustion. Weeks later, Olga did something even more extraordinary. She married Nikolai Kulikovsky. There was no lavish ceremony, no imperial spectacle. The union was modest, almost defiant in its simplicity, for the first time in her life. Olga entered a marriage of her own choosing. She was 34 years old. The happiness that followed was fragile but real. For a brief moment, she experienced what she had been denied for decades: partnership, affection, emotional safety. She lived not as a symbol, but as a woman. Yet even as she embraced this long-delayed joy, the world around her was collapsing. The war dragged on. Food shortages worsened. Soldiers mutinied. Workers struck. Trust in the monarchy evaporated. Rumors of revolution spread openly through the streets of St. Petersburg. Olga was pregnant. Her personal future, finally reclaimed, was unfolding at the same moment her family's political future was imploding. History had granted her happiness, but only briefly, because the Romanov Empire was reaching its breaking point, and soon, everything, titles, palaces, loyalties, and lives, would be swept away. When Olga Alexandrovna married Nikolai Kulikovsky in 1916, it felt as though she had stepped out of one life and into another, for the first time. Her days were not dictated by court schedules or suffocating expectations. She lived more quietly, more privately. She shared meals, conversations, and silences that were not ceremonial, but real. It was a modest happiness, fragile, understated, and deeply precious. And then she became a mother. In August 1917, amid the thunder of a collapsing empire, Olga gave birth to her first son, Tikhon. 2 years later, in April 1919, her second son, Guri, was born. These children were not cradled by imperial certainty. They were born into chaos. Russia in 1917 was unrecognizable. The war had drained the country dry. Millions were dead or wounded. Food shortages were constant. Inflation spiraled. Faith in leadership had vanished. In March, mass protests in Petrograd forced Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate the throne. The Romanov dynasty, after more than 300 years, collapsed in a matter of days. For Olga, the news was devastating. Nicholas was no longer Tsar. He was no longer protected by the authority that had once seemed absolute. He, Alexandra, and their children were placed under house arrest. The family that had ruled Russia now lived as prisoners of the state they once commanded. Olga, heavily pregnant and newly married, could do nothing but watch. The abdication did not bring peace. In October 1917, a second, far more radical revolution erupted. The Bolsheviks seized power. dismantling what remained of the old order. The language of compromise vanished, replaced by the rhetoric of enemies and traitors. The Romanovs were no longer relics of the past. They were symbols to be erased. Fear became constant. Olga and Nikolai were moved repeatedly, their movements restricted, their safety uncertain. They were eventually sent to the Crimean Peninsula, where several Romanov relatives were gathered under guard. Crimea was beautiful, but it was a cage. Rumors spread daily. Executions, disappearances, entire branches of the Romanov family vanishing without explanation. The revolution was no longer political. It was personal, brutal, and unforgiving. Olga clutched her infant son and listened. She thought of Nicholas, of Alexandra, of her nieces, especially Anastasia. She replayed memories endlessly, haunted by the possibility that she might never see them again. In the early hours of July 17, 1918, those fears became reality. Nicholas II, his wife, and their 5 children were executed by Bolshevik guards in Yekaterinburg. The killings were carried out secretly, brutally, without trial. Their bodies were hidden, their deaths denied for years. When the truth reached Olga, it broke something inside her that never fully healed. Her brother, her sister-in-law, the children she had adored. Gone. The Romanov dynasty had not simply fallen, it had been slaughtered. Olga's grief was compounded by terror. If Nicholas could be murdered, anyone could. The Romanovs in Crimea expected death at any moment. Guards watched closely. Orders could change overnight. Survival felt arbitrary. Yet fate intervened. As the Russian Civil War intensified, control of Crimea shifted. White army forces briefly gained the upper hand, pushing back Bolshevik troops. Foreign governments intervened cautiously, extracting select members of the Imperial family before the Red Army could reclaim the region. Olga, Nikolai, and their infant son were among the lucky few. In November 1919, they fled Russia for the last time. There were no ceremonies, no farewells, no guarantees. Just hurried departures, guarded ships, and the knowledge that return was impossible. The land she had been born to rule was now closed to her forever, as their ship pulled away. Olga did not look back. Russia was no longer her home. It was a grave. She carried her children into exile, knowing that they would never walk the halls of Peterhof, never speak Russian as natives of the land, never understand the empire that had shaped and destroyed their family. Her sons were free of titles, free of crowns, free of the curse that had followed the Romanovs for generations, but freedom came at a cost. Olga Alexandrovna had survived revolution, war, and the destruction of her family. She had gained love, motherhood, and escape. What she had lost was everything else, and exile, true exile, was only beginning. By late 1918, survival for the remaining Romanovs was no longer a matter of status or negotiation. It was a matter of timing. After the execution of Nicholas II and his family, the illusion that any Romanov might be spared collapsed completely. News traveled slowly and incompletely, but fear traveled fast. Whispers of mass executions, secret orders, and sealed lists circulated among guards and prisoners alike. In Crimea, where Olga Alexandrovna, Nikolai Kulikovsky, and their infant son were being held, every dawn felt provisional. They lived under house arrest alongside Grand Duchess Xenia and other relatives. Their movements were restricted, communication was monitored, guards changed without explanation. Some were indifferent, others were openly hostile. No one knew who might receive orders, or when. Olga slept lightly, if at all, each night. She prepared herself for footsteps in the corridor, for the sound of a door opening, for a name being called. She kept her son close, listening to his breathing, memorizing his face in case morning never came. This was not paranoia. Other Romanovs were disappearing. Some were taken away quietly. Others were executed without warning. Bodies were buried in unmarked graves. Names were erased from records. The revolution was systematic now. No longer chaotic. It understood symbolism, and the Romanovs were its most powerful symbol. Olga understood something crucial. If the Bolsheviks regained full control of Crimea, she and her family would not survive. Their fate shifted suddenly, not because of mercy, but circumstance. As the Russian Civil War intensified, the balance of power in Crimea changed. White army forces, opposed to the Bolsheviks, temporarily gained control of the region, for the first time in months. The Guards' posture shifted. Authority became uncertain. Orders conflicted. Hope returned, but cautiously. Foreign governments, particularly Denmark and Britain, began discreet evacuation efforts for surviving Romanovs. These were not humanitarian missions. They were calculated, limited, and politically sensitive. Not everyone would be saved. Selection was arbitrary. Timing was everything. In the chaos of collapsing authority, Olga received word, quietly, urgently, that she and her family could be evacuated. There were no guarantees, no formal protections. Only a narrow window before the Bolsheviks advanced again. They had to leave immediately. There was no time for hesitation. In November 1919, Olga, Nikolai, and their child fled Crimea under cover of confusion and retreat. They carried almost nothing. No jewels, no documents of power, no symbols of rank, only what they could hold and what they could not afford to lose. As they moved through ports and checkpoints, Olga concealed her identity whenever possible. Titles were dangerous now. Being recognized as a Romanov was not a privilege. It was a death sentence. They found temporary refuge in the residence of the Danish consul, protected briefly by diplomatic uncertainty rather than law. From there, they were moved again, across the Black Sea, through unstable territories, surrounded by refugees, soldiers, and exiles. The empire Olga had been born into was dissolving around her in real time. Cities changed hands overnight. Flags were replaced. Borders ceased to matter. The old world was collapsing, and no one knew what would replace it. For months, the family drifted. They passed through Constantinople, where displaced Russians crowded docks and streets, clinging to rumors of return that Olga knew were lies. She saw former aristocrats begging, officers selling medals for food, families fractured beyond repair. She did not romanticize exile. She understood it as survival stripped bare. Finally, after endless uncertainty, they reached Denmark, the homeland of Olga's mother, Empress Maria Feodorovna, who had escaped Russia earlier with British assistance. Their reunion was quiet, heavy with grief and relief. They were alive, but they were no longer who they had been. The cost of survival weighed on Olga deeply. She carried guilt. Why had she lived when so many had not? Why had her brother's children been murdered while her own slept safely in her arms? There were no answers, only facts. The Romanov dynasty was effectively dead. Russia was lost. Return was impossible. The world that had defined her identity, her language, her faith, her place, was gone. What remained was a future she had never been trained to face. Olga Alexandrovna had survived the revolution not because she was powerful, but because she had learned something rare among Romanovs: how to adapt, how to disappear, how to let go. She had escaped execution, imprisonment, and erasure. But exile would test her in a different way, because living without a crown is not the same as living without consequence. And for Olga, survival was no longer about escaping death. It was about learning how to live after everything that once defined her had been destroyed. When Olga Alexandrovna stepped onto Danish soil in 1920, she did not arrive as a princess returning home. She arrived as a refugee. There were no crowds, no ceremony, no recognition of rank. The woman who had once been born into palaces now carried her past like a sealed wound, present, painful, and largely invisible to the world around her. Denmark was familiar, yet foreign. It was the homeland of her mother, Empress Maria Feodorovna, who had escaped Russia earlier with British assistance. The reunion between mother and daughter was restrained, shaped by grief rather than celebration. Too much had been lost for joy to come easily. Too many names could no longer be spoken aloud. They did not talk much about Russia. There was nothing left to say. For Olga, exile was not a single moment. It was a process of erasure. Each day stripped away another layer of identity she had once taken for granted. She was no longer addressed by title, no longer guarded, no longer feared or revered. She was simply a woman with a husband, a child, and no country. At first, they lived modestly in Copenhagen, housed temporarily at Amalienborg Palace. Not as rulers, but as relatives. The contrast was jarring. The same architecture that once symbolized power now served as shelter. The grandeur no longer belonged to her. It surrounded her as something borrowed, temporary. Olga understood the difference immediately. Her mother, once Empress of Russia, now lived as a royal dowager in quiet decline. The Danish court treated her with respect, but the world had moved on. Monarchies across Europe were weakening, thrones were falling. Royal blood no longer guaranteed relevance. For Olga, this was oddly liberating, without the weight of empire. She was free to redefine herself, though the freedom came without instruction or safety net. She had never been trained to live an ordinary life, yet she approached it with determination rather than bitterness. When her mother died in 1928, the last strong tie to her former world was severed. The estate at Vidura, which had served as a summer refuge for Russian and British royals, was sold. The proceeds were divided among surviving family members. Olga's share was modest by royal standards, but it represented something unprecedented. Independence. With it, Olga made a choice that astonished nearly everyone who knew her. She bought a small farm near Ballerup, just outside Copenhagen. There were no servants, no guards, no ceremony, just land, animals, and work. Real work. Olga rose early. She cleaned. She cooked. She tended livestock. She labored in the fields alongside her husband. Her hands grew rough, her clothes practical, her life structured by seasons rather than schedules. For a woman raised in imperial confinement, this simplicity felt honest. She painted to support the family, small works on canvas, paper, and ceramic. Her art was unpretentious, grounded in memory and observation. Rural scenes, horses, landscapes, faces shaped by loss rather than grandeur. Over time, her work found buyers. Slowly, deliberately, she built a life from fragments. The Russian exile community gravitated toward her farm. Former officers, aristocrats, and families displaced by revolution visited often. They spoke of return, of hope, of restoring what had been lost. Olga listened, but she did not indulge illusions. She had seen too much. She maintained connections to European royalty, but without nostalgia, holiday visits to Sweden, quiet interactions with relatives who still wore crowns. She observed them with the detachment of someone who knew how fragile such things were. She had buried an empire. She did not miss it. Yet exile carried its own ghosts. Rumors circulated endlessly about survivors, about secret escapes, about Romanov children who had lived, in particular. The legend of Anastasia refused to die. Claims emerged across Europe. One woman, Franziska Szanskovska, later known as Anna Anderson, insisted she was Nicholas II's youngest daughter. In 1925, Olga traveled to Berlin to meet her. She did not believe the claim. The woman spoke German, not Russian. She could not speak English. Her appearance did not match memory. Time could change faces, but not essence. Olga left convinced not of deception, but of deep psychological damage. Another victim of the revolution. Another life broken beyond recognition. By the late 1930s, Olga's world had stabilized, but never fully healed. She lived quietly, productively, and without illusion. Her sons grew. Her marriage endured. Her past remained present, but no longer dominant. She had learned how to live without certainty. What she did not yet know was that history was not finished with her. Because exile, like power, is never permanent, and soon the world would fall into war once again, dragging even those who thought they had escaped history back into its reach. For nearly 2 decades, Olga Alexandrovna believed she had outrun history. Denmark was quiet, predictable, safe. Her days followed the rhythm of seasons rather than politics. She rose early, worked the land, painted in spare hours, and raised her sons far from the shadows of palaces and firing squads. The world she had lost felt distant, almost unreal. Then, in 1939, Europe caught fire again, when World War II broke out. Olga recognized the early signs immediately. She had seen them before: governments posturing, borders hardening, rumors accelerating faster than facts. The sense that something vast and uncontrollable was moving beneath ordinary life. She was no longer a princess, but she was still a witness. In April 1940, German forces invaded and occupied Denmark and Norway in a rapid military operation. The occupation was swift, efficient, and deeply unsettling. Overnight, Denmark ceased to be neutral. Flags changed. Authority shifted. Fear returned. For Olga, the invasion reopened old wounds. She had fled one collapsing empire, only to watch another form of authoritarian power spread across Europe. Once again, soldiers filled streets. Once again, loyalty was questioned. Once again, survival depended on restraint and invisibility. Her sons, Tikhon and Guri, were now grown men, serving in the Danish army. Their uniforms filled Olga with pride and dread in equal measure. During the early stages of the war, both were taken prisoner by German forces for a period of time. The fear was paralyzing. Olga had lost too many family members to violence to accept uncertainty easily. Each day without news stretched endlessly. Memories of Nicholas's children, executed without warning, haunted her thoughts. She had learned long ago that waiting could be fatal. Fortunately, her sons survived captivity and were eventually released, but the message was clear. No one was beyond reach anymore. The occupation placed the family under constant strain. Food was rationed, movement restricted, conversations guarded. Olga returned instinctively to the survival skills learned in Russia. Observe. Say little. Trust slowly. She did not draw attention to herself, though her royal lineage was known. It carried little protection in a Europe reshaped by ideology and force. Former titles mattered only if they served the regime. Olga's past was something to keep quiet, not display. As the war dragged on, another fear began to grow, one that felt disturbingly familiar. In 1945, as Nazi Germany collapsed, the balance of power in Europe shifted again. Soviet forces advanced westward, reclaiming territory and influence in the Baltic Sea. The Soviet Union occupied the Danish island of Bornholm, just south of Sweden, for Olga. This was more than a strategic maneuver. It was a warning. She understood the Soviet system intimately, not through theory, but experience. She knew how quickly categories like former royal could become death sentences, as long as Joseph Stalin remained in power. The Soviet Union represented not just an ideology, but a personal threat. The question she had hoped never to face returned with urgency. What if Denmark fell under Soviet control? The Cold War was taking shape, though few yet called it that. Borders hardened, alliances formed, uncertainty returned as a permanent condition for Olga. The idea of once again being trapped, this time by the very system that had murdered her family, was unbearable. She refused to wait for history to decide her fate. In 1948, at the age of 66, Olga made the decision to leave Europe altogether. The family traveled first to Britain, where they were temporarily housed at Hampton Court Palace through the goodwill of King George VI. A cousin. The irony was not lost on her, once again sheltered by royalty, yet no longer belonging to that world. Britain, however, was not the destination. Europe felt too close to old ghosts. A few weeks later, Olga and her family boarded a ship bound for Canada. It was her second permanent exile, and this time, she understood fully what it meant. She left behind not just a homeland, but a continent shaped by memories of loss, survival, and repetition. Canada represented distance, geographical and emotional, a place where her name meant nothing, where history might finally loosen its grip. When they arrived, they settled initially in Toronto, joining a small Russian exile community. The city was unfamiliar, expansive, and indifferent. That indifference was a gift. For the first time since her birth, Olga lived in a place that did not care who she had once been. She was no longer running from execution, no longer hiding from revolution, no longer measuring footsteps in hallways at night. But the weight of history never fully disappears. She carried it with her, into a new country, into old age, into silence. Because Olga Alexandrovna had learned something rare among survivors. You do not escape history. You outlive it. And sometimes, that is the heavier burden. By the late 1940s, Olga Alexandrovna had lived long enough to understand a truth few people ever face so directly. Survival does not mean peace. When she arrived in Canada, she was not searching for happiness. She was searching for distance from Europe, from history, from the shadows that had followed her since childhood. Canada offered space, anonymity, and the possibility of a life defined not by what she had lost, but by what remained. At first, the family settled in Toronto. The city was practical, unromantic, and indifferent to titles. People did not bow. They did not whisper. They did not care that she had once been the sister of a czar. To most, she was simply an elderly immigrant woman with a faint accent and a quiet manner. Olga welcomed that invisibility, yet old instincts lingered. She watched carefully, spoke cautiously, trusted slowly, even in a democratic country. She never fully forgot how quickly societies could turn hostile. The habit of vigilance, once learned, does not fade easily. Her sons built lives of their own. Tikhon and Guri married, started families, and integrated into Canadian society with a fluency Olga never fully achieved. They were shaped by exile, but not imprisoned by it. They did not carry the same memories, the same ghosts. For Olga, adaptation came harder. in an effort to recreate the simplicity she had known in Denmark. The family purchased a farm near Campbellville, Ontario. The decision was well-intentioned and deeply flawed. Farming in post-war Canada required labor, machinery, and stamina Olga and Nikolai no longer possessed. They were nearing 70. Workers were scarce. Costs mounted. Physical strain took its toll. Slowly, reluctantly. Olga accepted what she had avoided acknowledging. This phase of her life was ending too. In 1952, they sold the farm and returned to Toronto. Age was asserting itself now. Nikolai's health declined steadily, leaving him increasingly immobile. Olga became his caretaker, patient, devoted, and resilient. She had endured far worse than illness. Love, once denied her, now anchored her final years. Still, loneliness crept in. Friends from the old world were dying. The Russian exile community thinned. Conversations increasingly turned toward memory rather than future. Olga painted constantly, on canvas, paper, ceramic, producing thousands of works over her lifetime. Art became both refuge and record, a way of organizing memory without words. She lived frugally, not out of necessity, but principle. Excess felt wrong after everything she had witnessed. By the time of her death, she had quietly accumulated a modest fortune earned through discipline and restraint. Not inheritance. In August 1958, Nikolai Kulikovsky died after years of ill health. With him, Olga lost the last person who knew her not as a symbol, but as a woman. Their marriage, forged late and tested by catastrophe, had been the most stable relationship of her life. She was alone again, 2 years later. As her own health deteriorated, Olga moved into a small apartment in East Toronto, assisted by friends. She declined public attention, declined nostalgia, declined the temptation to mythologize her life. She had lived too close to history to romanticize it. On November 24, 1960, Olga Alexandrovna fell into a coma and died shortly afterward at the age of 78. Her funeral, held days later, was unexpectedly crowded. Former exiles, distant relatives, admirers, quiet mourners who understood what her life represented. Not glory, but endurance. She was buried beside her husband in York Cemetery. Far from Russia, far from palaces, far from the land that had shaped and destroyed her family. 7 months earlier, her sister Xenia had died in England. With Olga's passing, the last surviving child of any Russian Tsar was gone. An era ended not with ceremony, but with silence. Olga Alexandrovna never returned to Russia. She never reclaimed power. She never sought revenge or restoration. She outlived her empire, adapted to its absence, and refused to let it define her final years. She was born into absolute authority. She died as a private citizen. Between those 2 points lay revolution, war, exile, grief, and survival. Not the kind celebrated in textbooks, but the kind lived quietly, day after day, by someone who learned that the greatest victory is not ruling history, but enduring it. History does not announce itself politely when it returns. For Olga Alexandrovna, the years following her quiet resettlement in Canada felt deceptively calm. She had survived empire, revolution, exile, and war. She had buried nearly everyone who had shared her childhood world. The past, she believed, had finally loosened its grip. But history is patient, even in North America, far from palaces, firing squads, and borders redrawn by force. The aftershocks of the 20th century continued to shape her life. The Cold War hardened attitudes. Old enemies became ideological absolutes. Russia, Now the Soviet Union was no longer a place on a map. It was a symbol of fear, suspicion, and unresolved trauma. For Olga, it was personal. She followed world events closely, not out of nostalgia, but vigilance. Stalin remained in power. The same system that had ordered the execution of her brother and nieces now projected influence across Eastern Europe. The idea that history could reverse itself, that borders could shift again, never fully left her mind. She had learned the cost of disbelief. In Canada, she lived quietly, avoiding public commentary on Russia. When asked about her past, she responded carefully, offering facts without drama. She did not indulge in anti-Soviet speeches or monarchist fantasies. She had no illusions left to defend. What she carried instead was memory, precise, restrained, and heavy. Her experience had taught her that collapse does not always come with violence. Sometimes it arrives as fatigue, as erosion, as people slowly losing faith in institutions that no longer serve them. She recognized those patterns instantly when she saw them elsewhere in the world, yet she refused bitterness. Unlike many exiles, Olga did not define herself by what had been taken from her. She did not cling to titles or demand recognition. She had seen too clearly how quickly status evaporated when power shifted. Survival had taught her humility, not as weakness, but clarity. She lived among ordinary people. Neighbors knew her as a reserved older woman who painted constantly and spoke with a slight accent. Some knew fragments of her story. Few grasped its full scope. She preferred it that way. Being known had once been dangerous. In moments of solitude, however, the past returned uninvited. She dreamed of Peterhof, sunlight on water, the sound of fountains, the sense of permanence that had once felt natural. She dreamed of Anastasia, laughing, irreverent, alive. She dreamed of corridors filled with footsteps that would never return. These were not indulgent memories. They were reminders. Olga understood that the Romanovs had not fallen by chance alone. Autocracy, isolation, and denial had hollowed the empire from within long before revolution delivered the final blow. She did not excuse the violence, but she did not romanticize her family's rule either. That clarity set her apart. She belonged neither to the old world nor fully to the new one. She was a bridge, fragile, aging, but intact, between two historical realities that rarely spoke to each other honestly. As the 1950s progressed, invitations arrived from time to time, royal events, commemorations, even academic inquiries into the Romanov past. Olga declined most of them. She did not want her life turned into a symbol. She had seen what symbols were used for. Instead, she focused on what remained within her control: her work, her routines, her small circle of trust. She painted compulsively, not for fame or validation, but because painting allowed her to organize memory without words. Each brushstroke was deliberate, grounded, unsentimental. Art was safer than speech. As age pressed in, she sensed her role narrowing. She was no longer shaping events, only observing them. The world no longer expected anything from her, and in that absence of expectation, she found a kind of peace. Yet even peace carried weight. To outlive an empire is to carry its ghosts alone. By the end of her life, Olga Alexandrovna understood something few survivors articulate clearly. History does not end when violence stops. It ends when the last witness is gone. And she knew, with quiet certainty, that her time as a witness was drawing to a close. The world would move on. Russia would change again. Stories would be simplified. But the truth, complex, uncomfortable, human, had lived inside her, and soon it would belong only to history, long after the Romanov Empire had vanished from the map. It continued to live on in another form, as a myth, for Olga Alexandrovna. This was one of the most exhausting legacies of survival, not the loss of power, not even exile, but the way the dead refused to stay buried in the public imagination, history. She learned, did not simply record tragedy, it reshaped it, romanticized it, and, at times, distorted it beyond recognition. No story haunted her more than that of Anastasia, officially, Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and all 5 of their children had been executed in July 1918. Yet for decades afterward, uncertainty surrounded their deaths. The Soviet regime withheld details. Bodies were hidden. Records were sealed. In the absence of truth, speculation flourished. Rumors spread quickly across Europe. One child had escaped. A daughter had survived. Anastasia was alive, for many. The idea was irresistible, a fairy tale emerging from horror. For Olga, it was a wound constantly reopened. In the early 1920s, a woman named Franziska Shanskowska appeared in Berlin after a failed suicide attempt. Over time, she began claiming she was Grand Duchess Anastasia Nikolaevna, the youngest daughter of Nicholas II. The press seized the story eagerly. Monarchists rallied. Skeptics argued. The legend took on a life of its own. By 1925, Olga could no longer ignore it. She traveled to Berlin to meet the woman herself. The encounter was brief and decisive, from the moment they spoke. Olga knew the truth. The woman spoke German fluently, but could not converse in Russian or English, languages Anastasia had spoken from childhood. Her mannerisms were wrong, her memories inconsistent, her face unfamiliar in ways time alone could not explain. Yet Olga did not accuse her of fraud. She believed something more tragic. The woman was deeply unwell, psychologically damaged by trauma, desperate for identity, clinging to a story that gave meaning to her pain. Olga left convinced not of deception, but of human collapse under unbearable weight. She refused to endorse the claim, but she also refused to exploit it. Others were less restrained. For decades, the Anastasia mystery persisted. Lawsuits were filed, books were written, films were made. The Romanov tragedy was transformed into entertainment, simplified, dramatized, sanitized. Olga watched all of this from a distance. She understood why people wanted to believe. Survival stories offered hope, closure, a sense that history had been less cruel than it truly was. But she also knew the cost of such myths. They erased the reality of what had happened. The Romanovs had not fallen through accident or misunderstanding. They had been destroyed deliberately by a system that believed annihilation was necessary to erase the past. To soften that truth was to misunderstand the century itself. Olga carried the full weight of that understanding. In private conversations with historians and family friends, she spoke plainly. There was no anger in her voice, only precision. She corrected inaccuracies when necessary. She resisted nostalgia. She insisted on complexity where others wanted simplicity. She did not defend her family uncritically. She acknowledged their failures, their isolation, their refusal to change when change might have saved them. She did not absolve the empire, but she never justified its destruction either. This balance made her uncomfortable company for extremists on either side. Monarchists wanted symbols. Revolutionaries wanted villains. Olga offered neither. She existed in the space between, where history is lived rather than argued. As the years passed, new evidence slowly emerged. Soviet archives opened partially. Remains were discovered. DNA testing, unimaginable in Olga's youth, would eventually confirm what she had always known. There were no survivors. The children had died with their parents. By the time that confirmation arrived publicly, Olga was gone, but her quiet certainty had never wavered. She had carried the truth without spectacle, without profit, without illusion. for her. The Romanov story was not a legend. It was family. And families do not become myths without losing something essential along the way. As she aged, Olga understood that memory itself was fragile, that stories would outlive witnesses, that future generations would encounter the Romanovs first through books, films, and headlines, not through lived experience. She accepted that loss too. What mattered to her was not how history judged the empire, but whether it remembered that human lives had been caught inside it, loved, feared, hoped, and suffered in ways no narrative could fully capture. She had survived long enough to see the Romanovs transformed into symbols, but she had lived them as people, and that distinction, she knew, would disappear when the last witness was gone. Soon, that witness would be her. By the mid-1950s, Olga Alexandrovna understood something that no title could prepare a person for. She was becoming the last living memory of an empire. One by one, the people who had shared her world vanished. Former courtiers, exiled nobles, childhood companions, even her own siblings. Letters slowed, then stopped. Names that once carried entire histories became dates on paper. Then memories only she could still summon accurately. Being the last was not dramatic. It was quiet. There were no ceremonies to mark it, no official acknowledgement. History did not knock on her door to announce that she now carried something irreplaceable. It simply happened, gradually, relentlessly, until one day she realized that when she closed her eyes, entire rooms, voices, and faces would disappear with her. She did not speak of this often. Olga had never been sentimental. She did not narrate her life as a tragedy, nor did she see herself as a heroine. Survival had stripped her of romanticism. What remained was a calm, almost clinical awareness of time and loss. She lived simply in Toronto, surrounded by familiar routines. Morning tea, painting, short walks, occasional visitors from the Russian exile community or distant relatives curious about the past. She welcomed conversation, but only if it was honest. She had little patience for nostalgia. When people spoke longingly of Imperial Russia, she corrected them gently. There was beauty, yes, but also arrogance, blindness, and cruelty. When people demonized the past entirely, she resisted that too. Human lives, she reminded them, are never cleanly divided into villains and victims. This insistence on nuance isolated her. The world preferred simple stories. Olga refused to provide them, as her health declined. She became increasingly aware that her memory itself was an archive, unwritten, uncatalogued, fragile. There were things she had never told anyone, not because they were secret, but because no one had asked the right questions. She remembered smells, sounds, the weight of silence in rooms after executions were announced, the way fear traveled faster than news, the way people adjusted to terror not by screaming, but by lowering their voices. These details never appeared in history books. They lived only in her. Sometimes she considered writing everything down. Others encouraged it. But she hesitated. Words fixed memory in ways that could betray it. She feared simplification more than forgetting. What she had lived was too complex to be reduced cleanly, so she painted instead. Her paintings from this period were restrained, almost austere. Landscapes without figures, horses standing still, winter scenes heavy with silence. They were not grand, but they were precise, acts of preservation rather than expression. Each canvas was a refusal to disappear completely. As the Cold War intensified, interest in the Romanovs returned in waves. Journalists wrote, filmmakers speculated, academics debated. Olga watched from the margins. increasingly detached. She did not correct everything. Some distortions, she realized, were inevitable. History would shape itself around needs she no longer shared. She had reached an age where letting go became easier than fighting. What mattered most to her was not legacy. It was truth, quietly held. In August 1958, when her husband Nikolai Kulikovsky died, Olga felt a different kind of finality. He had been her chosen life, the one decision she had made entirely for herself. With him gone, the last chapter closed almost imperceptibly. She did not fear death. She had lived alongside it too long, in her final years. She moved less, spoke less, painted less, but her mind remained sharp, observant, grounded. She watched the world continue without her involvement and felt no resentment. She had already said goodbye to empires. When she died in November 1960, newspapers noted her passing briefly. The last surviving child of a Russian czar, a historical footnote, a closing bracket. But those who knew her understood something different. She had not been the last because she held power. She had been the last because she had endured. She carried a century inside her, its violence, its illusions, its transformations, and released it without spectacle. No demands, no bitterness, no myth-making. History would go on without her. But for a moment, just a moment, it had lived, intact and unfiltered. Inside one quiet woman who had learned that the greatest burden is not losing everything. It is remembering it all alone. For years after the Russian Revolution, the Soviet state insisted on silence. No official confirmation, no burial sites, no public reckoning. The Romanovs, it seemed, were meant to vanish, not only from power, but from memory itself. For Olga Alexandrovna, this deliberate absence of truth was more unsettling than certainty would have been. She had accepted death. She had mourned it. What she could not accept was erasure, the attempt to pretend that lives, children, and history itself could be dissolved through secrecy. She knew what had happened. She had known since 1918, but knowing privately and seeing truth acknowledged publicly were very different things. In the years following her escape from Russia, Olga lived in a strange historical limbo. The world speculated endlessly about the fate of the Imperial family while she carried the weight of reality in silence. Some clung to hope. Others built myths. Governments avoided clarity for political convenience. The Soviet Union denied responsibility. The West hesitated to confront it, and in the middle of this uncertainty stood the survivors. Few, scattered, aging, who knew the truth but had little power to enforce it. Olga rarely spoke publicly about the executions, not because she doubted them, but because she understood how truth is consumed. Spoken too loudly, it became spectacle. Spoken carelessly, it became ammunition. She had no desire to see her family's deaths transformed into propaganda for any cause. Instead, she chose restraint. When asked directly, she answered clearly and briefly. Yes, they were dead. No, there were no survivors. Yes, it had been brutal. No, it could not be undone. She offered no embellishment, no condemnation, no absolution. Her calm unsettled people. Many expected rage. Others wanted tragedy framed as martyrdom. Olga offered neither. She spoke as someone who had lived long enough to understand that outrage does not resurrect the dead, and that memory, if mishandled, can become another form of violence. As decades passed, fragments of truth began to surface, despite official suppression. Witnesses emerged, Documents leaked, accounts aligned. The shape of the crime grew clearer. The Romanovs had been executed deliberately, systematically, without mercy, for Olga. This confirmation did not bring closure. Closure had come years earlier, alone, in exile, holding grief that had nowhere to go. What these revelations brought instead was a sense of inevitability. History, delayed but persistent, was catching up to what she had always known. Yet even as facts emerged, distortions persisted. The Romanovs were increasingly portrayed as symbols rather than people, either saints or tyrants, depending on the teller's agenda. Olga resisted both extremes. She did not deny her family's privilege or their failures, but she refused to accept narratives that justified murder as historical necessity. She had seen what necessity looked like. It wore uniforms. It followed orders. It erased children, blood. She understood. Leaves traces no ideology can fully scrub away in private conversations. Olga emphasized this point repeatedly. Revolutions do not cleanse history, they stain it. The Romanovs were not perfect, but neither were they abstractions. They were human beings destroyed by a system that believed annihilation equaled progress. That belief, she warned, never ends where it begins. Her perspective was shaped not by politics, but by proximity. She had held nieces in her arms. She had watched her brother struggle under impossible expectations. She had lived inside the contradictions of empire long before its collapse. She understood that power isolates, and isolation kills slowly as she aged. Olga sensed that public interest in the Romanovs would only grow after her death. Distance breeds curiosity. Time softens horror. Future generations would revisit the story not as lived reality, but as puzzle, romance, or cautionary tale. She accepted that too, but she hoped, quietly, that somewhere within the noise, the essential truth would remain, that the fall of the Romanovs was not inevitable because they were doomed by fate, but because systems that refuse to change eventually destroy everyone within them, including their children. Olga Alexandrovna had survived because she had learned, too late for many, but early enough for herself, that adaptation is not betrayal, and survival is not guilt. Her blood tied her to an empire. Her life proved that blood alone does not decide destiny. And even when an empire tries to erase its past through violence, the truth, carried quietly by those who lived it, outlasts the gunfire. If blood tied Olga Alexandrovna to the Romanov dynasty, exile became the inheritance she could never escape. It did not matter how many years passed, how many borders she crossed, or how thoroughly she rebuilt her life. Exile was not a location, it was a condition, a way of existing slightly out of alignment with the world around her. In Denmark, she had been a former Grand Duchess turned farmer. In Canada, she was an immigrant with an unplaceable accent and an unspoken past. Everywhere she lived, she belonged, and yet did not. This was the paradox of survival. Those who died in 1918 were frozen in time, their identities sealed by tragedy. Olga, by contrast, was forced to evolve, to adapt, to shed layers of self that no longer fit. Each transformation ensured survival, but each also widened the distance between who she had been and who she was becoming. She understood something many exiles never fully accept. You cannot go home, not because it no longer exists, but because you no longer exist as the person who left. Russia, even had it been accessible, would have been unrecognizable to her. The language had changed. The symbols were inverted. The past had been criminalized. Memory itself had been rewritten. And Olga had changed too. She had lived without servants, without titles, without protection. She had earned money with her hands and her art. She had buried a husband, raised sons, and grown old in a land that owed her nothing. That transformation was not heroic. It was necessary. Within the Russian exile community, she observed different responses to displacement. Some clung desperately to the past, speaking of return as though it were imminent even decades later. Others rejected it entirely, severing ties and refusing to speak Russian again. Olga chose neither extreme. She remembered without worship. She adapted without erasing. Her Russianness was internal, rooted in language, memory, and private ritual rather than politics or nostalgia. She celebrated Orthodox holidays quietly, cooked familiar dishes, spoke Russian at home, but she did not perform identity for others. This balance isolated her. To monarchists, she was insufficiently loyal to the idea of restoration. To revolutionaries, she remained irredeemably imperial. To the broader world, she was an anomaly, too ordinary for legend, too historic for obscurity. She accepted the solitude that came with that position. Exile also reshaped her understanding of power. In Russia, power had been omnipresent, unquestioned, and suffocating. In exile, she watched power operate differently through institutions, laws, and social contracts rather than divine right. No system was perfect, but the contrast was instructive. She saw how ordinary people shaped their own lives without waiting for permission, how disagreement did not automatically mean treason, how criticism could exist without execution. These observations did not turn her into a political activist. They made her realistic. She no longer believed in absolute solutions, not monarchy, not revolution, not ideology, only in human limits, and the danger of systems that deny them. As her sons grew into adulthood, she watched them navigate identity with greater ease than she ever could. They were shaped by her past, but not imprisoned by it. They spoke English fluently, built careers, married into families untouched by imperial collapse. This, she realized, was the true end of the Romanov story. Not in bloodshed or exile, but in normalcy. Her sons would not rule. They would not be hunted. They would not be symbols. They would live lives small enough to be safe. And that safety felt like victory. In quiet moments, Olga reflected on how little she resembled the child born at Peterhof Palace. That girl had been wrapped in certainty, in hierarchy, in the assumption that the world existed to serve her family's will. The woman she became trusted none of that. She trusted routines, work, personal loyalty, the slow accumulation of meaning through daily effort. These were not grand values, but they endured. Exile had stripped her down to essentials, and in doing so, it had given her something empire never could: perspective. She did not envy the dead their permanence. She did not resent the living their ignorance. She stood between those states, aware, uncelebrated, intact. History would remember her as the last daughter of a czar. But Olga Alexandrovna understood herself differently. She was not defined by what she lost. She was defined by what she learned to live without. Survival is often spoken of as a victory. For Olga Alexandrovna, it felt more like an accounting. Every year she lived added distance between herself and the world that had shaped her. Each birthday marked not celebration, but subtraction. Another voice gone. Another witness silenced. Another shared memory now carried by her alone. Survival. She learned. Exacts a price that is rarely acknowledged. It demands adaptation. Yes, but also restraint. It requires learning when not to speak, when not to remember out loud, when not to correct the stories others tell about a past they never lived. Survival teaches patience, but it also teaches loss in slow motion. By the time Olga reached old age, she had outlived not only an empire, but the context that made her life intelligible. People asked questions that revealed how far the world had moved on. They wanted explanations framed in modern language: good versus evil, heroes versus villains, inevitability versus accident. They wanted conclusions. Olga had none to offer. What she had lived did not resolve cleanly. It resisted moral shortcuts. The Romanovs were not saints. The revolutionaries were not saviors. The suffering was not redemptive. The violence was not necessary. It simply was, and it destroyed everything in its path. She had seen this too clearly to simplify it. As she aged, Olga became increasingly selective about memory. Not everything deserved to be carried forward. Some details were too personal, others too easily distorted. She understood that remembering everything is not wisdom, it is burden. So she chose. She remembered her father's voice more than his crown. She remembered her brother's uncertainty more than his authority. She remembered the children, their laughter, their defiance, their ordinary humanity more than the manner of their deaths. These choices were not denial. They were survival. In the evenings, when her hands trembled too much to paint, she sat quietly and allowed memory to pass through her without resistance. She did not cling to it. She did not push it away. She let it come and go. Like weather, this, too, was a skill learned over decades. She had watched people consumed by their past, by grievance, nostalgia, or rage. She refused that fate. The past, she believed, should inform life, not replace it. Yet even with discipline, some nights were heavy. She dreamed of corridors that no longer existed, of rooms filled with people whose names would mean nothing to future generations, of moments that history would never record because they were too ordinary, too human, too small. She woke from these dreams not in panic, but in acceptance. To survive is to accept that meaning is not guaranteed by scale. Empires fall, lives continue, memory fragments. What remains is not grandeur, but endurance. In her final years, Olga noticed how often people spoke of her as a conclusion. The last, this. The final, that. The language of endings followed her everywhere. She did not resist it, but she did not internalize it either. Endings, she knew, are rarely absolute. Her life had not been a straight line from power to obscurity. It had been a series of recalibrations, each one painful, each one necessary. She had lost status, homeland, family, certainty. In exchange, she had gained perspective, agency, and the rare knowledge of how fragile systems truly are. This knowledge did not make her bitter. It made her careful, careful with judgment, careful with nostalgia, careful with hope. She had learned that hope untethered from reality can be dangerous. It can excuse cruelty. It can prolong suffering. True hope, she believed, lived in small things, work done well, kindness offered quietly, lives built without illusion. Her sons embodied that hope. They lived without obsession over the past. They did not inherit her memories, only their consequences. They moved forward, rooted in places that did not demand reverence for what had been lost. This was the legacy Olga accepted most willingly. Not restoration, not remembrance, but continuation. When death finally approached, it did not arrive as an enemy. It came as a closing, gentle, unremarkable, overdue. She had no unfinished demands, no final declarations, no need to be understood by a world that would simplify her anyway. She had survived long enough. History would do what it always does: compress, dramatize, distort. Names would become symbols. Lives would become lessons. Olga Alexandrovna would become a paragraph, then a footnote, then a curiosity. She did not fear that. What mattered had already happened. She had lived, and sometimes, in a century defined by destruction. That was the most radical act of all. After everything that had been taken from her, Olga Alexandrovna learned to value something she had once been denied entirely: ordinariness. In Denmark, and later in Canada, life no longer revolved around ceremony or consequence on a grand scale. There were no decisions that affected millions, no expectations tied to bloodline, no rituals meant to uphold an illusion of permanence. What remained were tasks, simple, repetitive, grounding. She welcomed them. For a woman born into absolute power, the ability to live without significance was not a loss. It was relief. Each morning followed a predictable rhythm: meals prepared, letters answered, paint set out and cleaned away, animals tended to, seasons noticed not as metaphors for empire, but as practical realities: planting, harvest, winter, thaw. This routine rebuilt her slowly. In Imperial Russia, her life had been defined by what she represented. In exile, she became defined by what she did. The difference mattered more than she had ever anticipated. Work anchored her in the present. It left little room for abstraction or regret. She did not romanticize poverty or simplicity. There were days when money was tight, when physical labor exhausted her, when the contrast between what she had been and what she had become felt sharp and unfair. But even then, she preferred this life to the one she had escaped. Because here, suffering had a shape she could understand. In Denmark, she had watched former princes struggle with irrelevance, clinging to titles that no longer opened doors. In Canada, she saw immigrants from dozens of countries do what she had done, start again without guarantees. This commonality mattered to her. It reminded her that history had not singled her out. She was one of many displaced by forces larger than themselves. Her accent marked her as foreign. Her age set her apart. But her habits, work, restraint, attentiveness, made her familiar. Neighbors knew her as reliable, reserved, and kind. Few asked about her past. Fewer still pressed when she did not offer it. She was grateful for that restraint. Public identity had once been a threat. Privacy now felt like protection. As years passed, Olga noticed how easily people assumed that loss must dominate a survivor's life. They expected bitterness, nostalgia, or obsession. She offered none of these, not because they were absent, but because they were managed. She understood that grief does not disappear. It integrates. Loss becomes part of the background, no longer overwhelming, but always present. It shapes decisions quietly. It informs caution. It sharpens empathy. Olga had lived long enough with loss to know how to carry it without letting it lead. This skill was not innate. It was learned through repetition, discipline, and refusal to indulge in fantasy. She did not imagine alternative outcomes, did not speculate on what might have been. Such thinking, she believed, was a luxury for those untouched by catastrophe, for those who had lived through it. Acceptance was survival, in small moments. However, the past surfaced unbidden: a scent, a piece of music, the cadence of the Russian language overheard unexpectedly. These moments did not overwhelm her. They paused her. She allowed that pause. Then she returned to what was in front of her. Her paintings from this period reflected that balance. They were not scenes of empire or exile, but of landscapes, animals, interiors, spaces defined by stillness rather than drama. Critics would later describe them as modest, even restrained. They missed the point. Restraint was the point. Olga Alexandrovna had lived through extremes. She no longer trusted excess of emotion, ideology, or ambition. She trusted continuity. Small acts repeated over time. Lives built quietly enough to be overlooked by history. This was the life she chose in the end. Not as retreat, not as defeat, but as resolution. Because when everything grand has been stripped away, what remains is not emptiness, but choice. And Olga Alexandrovna, once denied that entirely, chose a life small enough to survive the century that had tried to destroy her as the years passed. Olga Alexandrovna became accustomed to a strange silence, the kind that follows catastrophe long after the world has moved on. It was not the silence of absence, but of resolution. In Canada, life did not ask her to explain herself. There were no expectations tied to her name, no assumptions about her relevance. She existed without urgency, without consequence beyond her own small circle. For someone who had spent her early life under constant scrutiny, this anonymity felt almost unnatural at first. Then it became essential. She noticed how quickly people around her accepted the present as permanent. Children grew without knowledge of wars that had defined entire generations. Adults discussed the future with confidence that borders would hold, that institutions would endure. Olga did not challenge them. She had learned that certainty is often temporary, and that insisting otherwise rarely changes anything. Instead, she observed. She watched Canada shape itself through compromise rather than decree. She saw disagreements handled publicly, imperfectly, but without mass terror. She noted how criticism did not automatically invite punishment. These observations did not make her idealistic. They made her appreciative. The contrast mattered. In Imperial Russia, silence had been enforced. In the Soviet Union, it had been strategic. Here, silence was optional, chosen, and for Olga, choice was everything. She continued to paint steadily. Though without ambition, the act itself mattered more than the result. Painting allowed her to remain present, to focus on texture, light, proportion, things that required attention but not interpretation in those moments. History loosened its grip. Visitors sometimes asked why she never painted palaces, crowns, or scenes from her past. She answered simply, she had lived them already. Her work was not an attempt to preserve what had been lost, but to acknowledge what remained. Fields, animals, rooms filled with quiet. These were not symbols. They were realities. She also wrote letters, carefully, deliberately, to a small group of correspondents who understood her boundaries. She did not indulge in long recollections. She shared observations, questions, reflections on ordinary life. The past entered only when necessary. Memory, she believed, should be handled with care. As age deepened its presence, Olga became increasingly selective with her energy. Long conversations tired her. Emotional displays felt unnecessary. She preferred company that understood silence, people who did not mistake restraint for coldness. She was not withdrawn. She was complete. The world, meanwhile, continued to reshape the Romanov story without her involvement. Books appeared. Films dramatized events she had lived through. Characters were simplified. Motives exaggerated. Violence aestheticized. She did not protest. She understood that history, once detached from witnesses, becomes malleable. Stories bend toward what audiences need rather than what actually happened. She had no desire to compete with that process. Her role was not to correct every distortion. It was to live truthfully. When asked directly about the past, she spoke plainly, without flourish, without defensiveness. Her tone unsettled people who expected either bitterness or nostalgia. She offered neither. She had learned that strong emotion often obscures understanding. As her physical world narrowed, her internal world stabilized. She no longer measured life by milestones or achievements. She measured it by balance, between remembering and letting go, between solitude and connection, between past and present. She did not fear obscurity. She had seen what fame did to truth. What mattered was that she remained intact, mentally, emotionally, ethically, after everything designed to fracture her. Empires had failed to do that. Exile had not undone her. Time itself had softened, but not erased her. In the quiet after the storm, Olga Alexandrovna lived without urgency, without illusion, and without regret. Not because her life had been easy, but because she had learned when to stop fighting history and start living beyond it. In the final stretch of her life, Olga Alexandrovna no longer felt pursued by history. It had not forgiven her. It had not explained itself. It had simply moved on. For most of her years, history had been something active, pressing, violent, intrusive. It had dictated where she could live, whom she could love, what she was allowed to be. Now, at last. It receded into the background, leaving behind a quieter question. Who is a person when history no longer needs them? Olga answered that question not with philosophy, but with practice. She lived deliberately small. Her days were shaped by physical limits and chosen routines. She woke early out of habit rather than obligation. She read slowly. She painted when her hands allowed. She rested without guilt. The pace of her life matched her age, unhurried, attentive, accepting. This was not resignation. It was alignment. She had spent her youth being shaped by forces beyond her control. In old age, she allowed herself to exist without resistance. There was dignity in that choice, one earned through survival rather than granted by rank, occasionally. Visitors recognized who she was. Some came out of curiosity, others out of reverence. A few hoped for stories that might confirm their own beliefs about monarchy, revolution, or destiny. Olga learned quickly how to redirect such conversations. She spoke of weather, of painting, of ordinary things, if pressed. She offered facts, not interpretations, dates, locations, names. She did not dramatize. She did not editorialize. She understood that meaning, once handed over, is easily reshaped by the listener. What mattered to her was not persuasion, it was integrity. As the decades passed, she became aware that her life was increasingly being framed as symbolic. The last daughter of a czar, a bridge between centuries, a living relic. She rejected those labels quietly. Symbols flatten experience. They strip away contradiction. Olga's life had been nothing if not contradictory, privileged and constrained, powerful and powerless, protected and hunted, ordinary and historic. She refused to let that complexity be reduced in private moments. She reflected on how little of her identity remained tied to Russia itself. Language faded, customs softened. The rhythms of Canadian life replaced those of Europe. She did not mourn this transformation. She had learned that identity is not preserved through rigidity, but through adaptation. What remained constant was not nationality or status, but character, shaped by endurance, restraint, and clarity. These qualities did not belong to any country. They belonged to survival. She also recognized that her story would not be remembered for what it truly was. It would be shortened, categorized, simplified. She accepted that too. History rarely preserves nuance. It prefers conclusions, heroes and villains, beginnings and ends. Olga had lived long enough to know that most lives, especially those lived honestly, do not fit such structures. Her life had not ended with triumph or restoration. It had ended with continuity. Her sons lived on. Their children grew. None of them bore titles. None of them carried crowns. They carried something quieter, the ability to live without fear of being erased for who they were. That, to Olga, felt like justice. In the evenings, when the world grew still, she sometimes allowed herself to remember without discipline, not events, but sensations. The sound of water at Peterhof, the smell of pine near Gacina, the warmth of a child's hand, the calm of a finished painting laid aside. These memories no longer hurt. They existed without demand. By the time her health began to fail, Olga Alexandrovna was no longer holding on to anything. She did not cling to identity, legacy, or explanation. She had made peace with incompleteness, with the knowledge that some questions remain unanswered and some losses unrepaired. That peace was not naive, it was earned. She had survived not by denying reality, but by meeting it repeatedly, each time with fewer illusions and greater precision. She had learned when to adapt, when to endure, and when to let go, when death approached. It did not feel like interruption. It felt like closure, not the dramatic closure of history books, but the personal kind, the quiet understanding that a life, lived fully and without deception, does not require validation. Olga Alexandrovna had been born into a world that believed itself permanent. She lived long enough to see it vanish, and she died knowing that permanence was never the point. What endured was something far less visible, but far more resilient, a human life, stripped of power, still intact, even as Olga Alexandrovna aged into the quiet margins of history. The past did not loosen its grip on the world around her. It resurfaced instead, reshaped, repackaged, and retold. By the mid-20th century, interest in the Romanovs surged again. Driven not by politics, but by fascination, the empire that had once terrified Europe was now safely distant, transformed into a subject of books, films, and speculation. What had been lived experience hardened into narrative. For Olga, this resurgence was unsettling. She had spent decades learning how to live beyond history, only to watch history circle back, this time as entertainment. The suffering of her family became material for dramatization. Tragedy was aestheticized, complexity flattened into myth. She did not participate. She understood instinctively that once suffering becomes spectacle, truth becomes optional. People no longer ask what happened, but what feels right. Memory bends toward emotion rather than accuracy. Olga refused that distortion. When approached by writers or journalists, she remained cautious. She answered factual questions without elaboration. She declined interviews that sought drama. She avoided projects that framed the Romanovs as either saints or villains. She would not cooperate with simplification. This restraint confused people. They expected bitterness or longing, rage or nostalgia. Instead, they encountered precision, dates, places, names, clear boundaries. No performance. Olga had learned that emotional excess invites manipulation. She had also learned that silence can be a form of control, behind closed doors. However, she watched as the Romanov story grew increasingly detached from reality. Films portrayed lavish courts untouched by hardship. Books invented secret escapes and hidden heirs. The line between evidence and fantasy blurred deliberately. The myth of Anastasia, long dismissed by Olga, refused to die. Each revival reopened questions she had already answered, patiently, definitively. Yet the public appetite for uncertainty was stronger than truth. Mystery sold better than closure. Hope proved more marketable than fact. Olga recognized the danger in this pattern. Myth does not merely obscure history, it replaces it. She understood how easily myths could be weaponized, how nostalgia for imagined pasts could fuel new forms of extremism. She had watched that process unfold once before, in a different century, with catastrophic consequences. This was why she resisted romanticization so fiercely. To romanticize empire was to forget its violence. To romanticize revolution was to excuse its brutality. Both erased the human cost. In private conversations, Olga spoke candidly about this tension. She reminded listeners that the Romanovs were neither monsters nor martyrs. They were people, flawed, insulated, and ultimately destroyed by a system that could not adapt. The revolutionaries, too, were not abstractions. They were individuals operating within an ideology that rewarded dehumanization, violence, once justified, multiplied easily. These truths made for uncomfortable conversation. They did not fit neatly into popular narratives. As the Cold War intensified, interest in Imperial Russia became increasingly politicized. The Romanovs were sometimes invoked as symbols of lost order, sometimes as proof of the cruelty of autocracy. Olga refused both uses. She had seen how symbols are exploited. Her own life had been shaped by the consequences of believing too deeply in them. In Canada, she remained deliberately distant from political discourse. She did not comment publicly on the Soviet Union beyond acknowledging its existence. She did not join monarchist organizations. She did not advocate for restoration or revenge. She believed such gestures belonged to people who had not lived through collapse. Her authority came not from argument, but from experience, and experience had taught her that the past cannot be corrected. It can only be understood. As she grew older, Olga sensed that her resistance would not last beyond her lifetime. Once she was gone, there would be no living counterweight to myth, no quiet voice insisting on complexity, no witness able to say, "I was there, and it was not like that." She accepted this inevitability. History, she knew, belongs to the living. It reshapes itself according to their needs, fears, and desires. Witnesses can delay distortion, but not prevent it. What mattered was that she had held the truth intact for as long as she could. She had not surrendered it to fantasy. She had not traded it for attention. She had carried it quietly, until carrying it was no longer possible. And as the world continued to retell the Romanov story in ways she could no longer influence, Olga Alexandrovna focused on what remained within her reach. A life lived honestly, memory held without illusion, and the knowledge that truth, even when ignored, still exists. History might speak louder, but she had already spoken enough. As Olga Alexandrovna entered the final decade of her life, she became increasingly aware of a widening gap, one she could feel but no longer close. It was the distance between what had happened and what was remembered. This distance troubled her more than obscurity ever had. Truth, she knew, is fragile when it no longer has witnesses. It survives only if it is inconvenient enough to resist simplification, and precise enough to withstand repetition. Memory, by contrast, is malleable. It adapts to emotion, to desire, to fear, over time. It becomes less about accuracy and more about meaning. Olga had lived on both sides of that divide. She had lived history as an unfolding present, uncertain, chaotic, and often incomprehensible. Now she watched it being retold as narrative, ordered, intentional, and falsely coherent. Events were given motives that had not existed at the time. Outcomes were framed as inevitable. Individuals were assigned roles they had never chosen. This disturbed her deeply, because inevitability erases responsibility. If the Romanovs were destined to fall, then no one had to answer for how they were destroyed. If the revolution was necessary, then its brutality could be excused. If suffering was simply the price of progress, then victims ceased to matter. Olga refused that logic. She had seen how easily people convinced themselves that cruelty was unavoidable once it was given a purpose. She had seen how language, used carelessly, could anesthetize conscience. She had lived inside a system that believed itself eternal, and watched another rise that believed itself justified. Both were wrong. In conversations with younger historians and students, Olga emphasized this point quietly but firmly. History is not a machine. It is a collection of choices, many made under pressure, fear, or ignorance. To strip those choices of agency was to misunderstand the past entirely. She did not argue loudly. She corrected gently. This, too, was a discipline learned through survival. She understood that people rarely abandon beliefs under attack. They reconsider only when confronted with calm contradiction. Even then, change was slow. As the years passed, she noticed that fewer people asked her questions seeking understanding. More often, they came seeking confirmation, hoping she would validate the version of history they already believed. When she did not, disappointment followed. She accepted that disappointment without apology. Her role was not to comfort, it was to be accurate, privately. She reflected on how memory had shaped her own life, how she had chosen what to carry forward and what to release. She understood that memory is never neutral. It is curated by necessity. No one can carry everything, but there is a difference between selection and distortion. Olga selected with care. She refused distortion. She remembered not only the grandeur of her childhood, but its confinement, not only the terror of revolution, but the blindness that preceded it, not only the cruelty of the new regime, but the failures of the old. This balance was uncomfortable. It satisfied no ideology fully. Perhaps that was why she was increasingly left alone. As she aged, invitations dwindled, interest shifted elsewhere. New crises replaced old ones. The world's attention moved on, as it always does. Olga felt no resentment toward this. She had learned that attention is transient and often dangerous. What mattered to her was that somewhere, beneath the layers of myth and interpretation, the truth remained intact, even if few sought it, even if many ignored it. Truth did not require popularity to exist. In moments of solitude, she acknowledged the limits of her influence. She could not control how the Romanovs would be remembered. She could not prevent the past from being reshaped by future needs. She could only ensure that she herself did not betray what she knew. That was enough. She had survived the erasure of her family. She would not participate in the erasure of their humanity. As her strength waned, Olga felt a growing sense of detachment, not from life, but from the struggle to be understood. She had lived long enough to accept that understanding is never complete and often unnecessary. What remained was a quiet certainty. She had told the truth when it mattered, She had lived without illusion. She had carried memory without exploiting it. History would do what it always does: simplify, dramatize, forget, remember. But somewhere within that process, the reality she had lived would persist, not because it was loud, but because it was true, and truth, she believed, does not need witnesses forever. It only needs one, long enough, toward the end of her life. Olga Alexandrovna no longer felt like a participant in history. She felt like its final connection. The world she had been born into, imperial, hierarchical, absolute, had vanished so completely that it now existed only as interpretation. Archives replaced memory. Scholars replaced witnesses. Reconstruction replaced experience. And Olga, quietly living in Toronto, remained one of the last people for whom that vanished world had once been ordinary. This awareness did not make her feel important. It made her cautious. She understood that being the last was a dangerous position. It invited projection. People wanted her to confirm their beliefs, validate their narratives, sanctify their conclusions. They wanted closure, preferably in a form that felt meaningful to them. Olga offered none of that. She had learned that the closer one is to events, the less dramatic they feel. History, when lived, is rarely coherent. It unfolds without structure, without clear moral arcs. Fear does not announce itself. Collapse does not arrive with speeches. It seeps in, quietly, until normality becomes unrecognizable. That was the truth she carried. When people asked her what Imperial Russia had really been like, she resisted the temptation to summarize. There was no single answer. There were mornings filled with beauty and evenings heavy with dread. There were moments of kindness inside a system capable of profound cruelty. There was order that bred stability and rigidity that bred disaster. To simplify any of it would have been dishonest. As her health declined, Olga became more inward-focused, not withdrawn, but selective. Energy, like memory, had to be rationed. She spent more time alone, not out of loneliness, but clarity. Solitude had become familiar long ago. It no longer frightened her. She thought often about how history chooses its endings. Empires fall on dates. Revolutions are marked by events. Deaths are recorded with times and places. But lived experience does not end cleanly. It fades, it fragments, it disperses into countless private memories that vanish one by one. Olga recognized that when she died. Something subtle would disappear with her. Not power, not lineage, but context. The ability to say, "This is how it felt," rather than "this is what happened." No archive could preserve that. She did not regret this loss. She accepted it as the natural cost of time. Every generation loses something irreplaceable when its witnesses pass. What remains is never complete, but it is enough to move forward in her final months. Olga spoke little about the past, not because it no longer mattered, but because she no longer needed to justify it. She had lived long enough to trust that truth does not vanish simply because it is no longer spoken aloud. She focused instead on presence, the light through a window, the sound of distant traffic, the quiet order of her small room. These details grounded her in the moment. They reminded her that life, stripped of narrative, still had texture and weight. When she thought of her family, she did not imagine them as historical figures. She remembered them as they had been before history claimed them: children impatient with lessons, siblings sharing jokes, a father whose authority softened in private. These memories were not burdens. They were companions. Olga Alexandrovna died knowing that she had not restored what was lost. She had not corrected history. She had not been understood fully, but she had endured without surrendering to illusion. She had refused to turn suffering into spectacle. She had refused to trade truth for comfort. She had refused to let power, or its absence, define her worth. In a century obsessed with extremes, she had chosen balance in a life marked by collapse. She had chosen continuity in a world that demanded symbols. She had insisted on humanity when she passed. The last living thread connecting the modern world to Imperial Russia was severed, not with drama, not with ceremony, but with quiet finality. History moved on, as it always does, and somewhere beneath its simplified stories and polished conclusions, the life of Olga Alexandrovna remained what it had always been. Not a legend, not a symbol, but a human being who lived long enough to see the world change, and chose, every time, to change with it without losing herself. When Olga Alexandrovna entered the final chapter of her life, the world no longer expected anything from her. That, in its own way, was fitting. Empires end loudly, through war, proclamations, executions, and revolutions. But those who outlive them often fade quietly, carrying within themselves the last intact memory of a vanished order. Olga had become one of those people, not a relic on display, but a living remainder. By the late 1950s, her life in Toronto had narrowed to a small, manageable radius, familiar streets, a modest apartment, a few trusted friends. Her sons visited when they could, bringing news of grandchildren who would grow up without any connection to crowns or palaces. She watched them with a sense of calm satisfaction. This was what survival was meant to produce, not restoration, but continuity, physically. Age was asserting itself. Her movement slowed. Her hands, once steady with brush and pen, trembled more often. Painting became sporadic, then rare, still. She kept her materials close, unwilling to declare any part of herself finished before it truly was. Her mind, however, remained clear. She followed world events in fragments, headlines, conversations, radio broadcasts. The Cold War deepened, alliances hardened, fear reorganized itself under new language. Olga recognized the pattern immediately. Different names, same instincts. She did not comment publicly. She had learned long ago that history repeats itself, not because people forget the past, but because they misunderstand it, remembering events without understanding their emotional reality. The fear, arrogance, denial, and desperation leads inevitably to repetition. Olga had lived that reality. She had seen how absolute confidence breeds fragility, how systems that cannot tolerate doubt collapse under pressure, how violence justified by necessity quickly loses its limits. These lessons remained with her, not as ideology, but as intuition. As her health declined, friends suggested she write her memoirs. Others offered to help document her life formally, to preserve her perspective for future generations. Olga declined politely, not out of secrecy, out of restraint. She believed that no single account, especially her own, could capture the complexity of what she had lived without distorting it. Memory, once fixed on paper, becomes authoritative in ways that can be misleading. She did not want her words to be used to settle debates she believed should remain open. History, she felt, should be questioned, not closed. Instead, she trusted that fragments of truth would survive elsewhere, in archives, in letters, in records, in the quiet consistency of facts that resisted myth. Her role had never been to control the narrative, only to live honestly within it. In August 1958, when her husband Nikolai Kulikovsky died, Olga felt the final shift occur with him. The last daily witness to her private life was gone. Their marriage had not been dramatic, but it had been real, built on choice rather than obligation. Losing him marked the end of her active participation in the present. From then on, she lived mostly in stillness. She was not lonely. She was complete in her final months. She spoke little about the future. She made no grand requests, no symbolic gestures. Her concerns were practical, arrangements, belongings, ensuring that nothing became a burden to those who remained. This, too, reflected her character. She had spent a lifetime watching systems collapse under the weight of excess, of pride, ideology, ambition. She would not leave disorder behind her. When death approached, it did not arrive as a rupture. It came as a closing. Olga Alexandrovna, born into the certainty of empire, had lived long enough to see that certainty dissolve and long enough to build something quieter in its place. The world would remember her as the last surviving child of a Russian czar. She understood herself differently. She was simply a woman who had lived through history without allowing history to consume her. And as the final era of her life drew to a close, there was nothing left to prove, only a life, fully lived, waiting to be gently concluded. In the autumn of 1960, Olga Alexandrovna understood, without being told, that time was narrowing. Her body tired more easily now. Simple tasks required planning. The world, once expansive and threatening, had contracted into a few rooms, a few familiar voices, a few daily rituals that anchored her gently to the present. She accepted this change without resistance. She had spent too much of her life resisting forces beyond her control. Now, she allowed herself to yield. After the death of Nikolai Kulikovsky, Olga moved into a small apartment in East Toronto, assisted by friends who respected her privacy and independence. The space was modest, functional, and quiet. It suited her. She had long ago shed any attachment to grandeur. Her days followed a careful rhythm. She woke early, as she always had. She drank tea slowly, listening to the muted sounds of the city outside, cars passing, footsteps on the pavement, the distant hum of life continuing without her involvement. She read when her eyes allowed. She painted occasionally, though more often she simply looked at her older works, running her fingers lightly across dried brushstrokes. These paintings were not reminders of loss. They were proof of continuity. Visitors came sparingly, family, a few close friends, members of the Russian exile community who understood that conversation did not need to fill silence. Olga did not entertain out of obligation. She welcomed presence, not performance. When people asked how she was feeling, she answered honestly but briefly. There was no drama in her voice. She did not frame decline as tragedy. It was simply another stage, one she had seen many others pass through before her. She spoke little about Russia now, not because it no longer mattered, but because it no longer demanded explanation. The past had settled into its proper place, neither denied nor indulged. It existed as memory, not as claim, in quiet moments. Olga reflected on the strange symmetry of her life. She had been born into absolute certainty, an empire convinced of its permanence. She would die in a world defined by uncertainty, nuclear tension, ideological division, and fragile peace. Between those points lay a century of collapse and reinvention. She did not attempt to extract meaning from this arc. Meaning, she believed, was not imposed. It emerged quietly through endurance. In November 1960, Olga's health deteriorated rapidly. A fall left her weakened, and shortly afterward she slipped into a coma. There was no panic, no emergency rush, only a calm recognition that the final transition had begun. Those who sat beside her noticed the stillness of her expression. It was not strained. It was resolved. On November 24, 1960, Olga Alexandrovna died at the age of 78. There were no final words, no dramatic farewell. Her life did not end with declaration or confession. It ended the way she had lived it for decades, quietly, deliberately, without spectacle. Her funeral, held several days later at York Cemetery in Toronto, surprised many by its attendance. Former exiles, distant relatives, quiet admirers, people who understood, each in their own way, that something irreplaceable had passed. She was buried beside Nikolai, the man she had chosen in defiance of expectation and in loyalty to herself. 7 months earlier, her sister Ksenia had died in England. With Olga's death, the last living child of any Russian Tsar was gone. There were no proclamations to mark the moment. No bells rang across continents. Yet an era ended all the same. The final living bridge between the Imperial 19th century and the fractured modern world had closed, not with collapse, but with completion. Olga Alexandrovna did not leave behind a restored dynasty or a rewritten history. She left behind something quieter and rarer, a record of how to endure without illusion, how to adapt without surrendering integrity, how to survive the destruction of a world and still choose to live honestly in the one that follows. History would continue to debate the Romanovs, but Olga's life required no debate. It stood, complete and unadorned, as proof that even when empires fall, a human life, lived with clarity and restraint, can remain whole to the very end. When Olga Alexandrovna was laid to rest in York Cemetery, Toronto, there was no sense of history closing its book, only a pause. The mourners who gathered that day did not come to honor a fallen empire. They came to acknowledge a life that had outlasted one. Former Russian exiles stood beside Canadians who knew her only as a quiet elderly woman with a foreign accent. Few speeches were made. None were necessary. The silence spoke more honestly than ceremony ever could. With Olga's death, something intangible vanished from the world. Not power, not legitimacy, not authority. What disappeared was living memory. For the first time since the Russian Empire had risen in the 17th century, there was no one left who had been born directly into its ruling family. No one who had walked its palaces as a child without knowing they would one day become ruins. No one who had felt, from the inside, what it meant for a world to believe itself eternal. That loss went largely unnoticed. Newspapers marked her passing briefly. Histories continued to be written without her voice. The Romanov story moved further into abstraction, analyzed, dramatized, reinterpreted according to the needs of new generations. And that was inevitable. Olga Alexandrovna had understood long before her death that history does not preserve individuals. It preserves patterns. Empires rise and fall. Revolutions promise renewal and deliver trauma. Power isolates itself until it collapses under its own weight. These patterns would repeat. What mattered was not whether the Romanovs were remembered kindly or harshly. What mattered was whether future generations learned to recognize the warning signs that Olga herself had lived through. Blind certainty, refusal to adapt, the belief that violence can erase the past. She had seen where those beliefs led. In the years following her death, evidence would finally surface publicly. Remains would be identified. DNA would confirm what Olga had always known. The Romanov children had not survived. There were no miracles, no secret heirs, only loss, delayed acknowledgement, and long denied truth. The myths would persist anyway. Olga would not have been surprised. She had lived long enough to know that truth does not triumph by default. It endures quietly, waiting for those willing to face it without comfort. Her own life became, gradually, a footnote, a human detail appended to larger arguments about monarchy, revolution, and ideology. Scholars debated structures. Filmmakers dramatized tragedy. Audiences consumed simplified versions of a complex past. Few paused to consider the woman who had lived through it all and chosen not to turn it into legend. Yet that choice was the most revealing aspect of her character. Olga Alexandrovna did not seek redemption through narrative. She did not try to justify her family's rule or condemn those who destroyed it. She understood that history is not a courtroom and memory is not a verdict. What she offered instead was something far rarer: witness without distortion. She had seen power from the inside and understood its fragility. She had survived terror without glorifying it. She had endured exile without romanticizing loss. And when given the chance to become a symbol, she refused. In a century obsessed with extremes, she lived in restraint. In a life shaped by collapse, she chose continuity. In a world that demanded meaning from tragedy, she accepted ambiguity. That was her final act of defiance, not against revolution, not against monarchy, but against simplification. Olga Alexandrovna was born into a world that believed it could last forever. She lived long enough to see that belief destroyed, not once, but repeatedly, and rather than clinging to what had been lost, she adapted to what remained. When the empire fell silent, she did not try to make it speak again. She listened, and in that listening, in her refusal to shout over history, to reshape it for comfort or pride, she left behind a different kind of legacy. Not an empire, not a dynasty, but an example that even when the world you are born into disappears, you can survive without surrendering truth. You can adapt without erasing memory. And you can live fully, quietly, honestly.